Hello everyone and welcome back to the Horror Hut. Now, I know a lot of you use these videos to sleep, so before you drift off I thought it would be a nice idea if everyone can leave a comment and let me know where you are listening from in the world. Also like and subscribe if you are enjoying the episodes. Right, let's get comfy and relax and let's begin. I went to the grocery store last week, just like I always do. It was a normal day, nothing strange, and I wasn't in a hurry. I parked near the back of the lot because it was crowded, but that didn't bother me. I kind of like the walk, it gives me a moment to breathe before diving into errands. The store was busy, so it took me a little longer than usual to get everything I needed. When I came out, it was starting to get dark. The street lights in the parking lot were on, but they didn't do much. You know that kind of half-light where you can see, but everything feels off? That's how it was. I walked to my car with my bags in hand, not thinking about much, just going through the motions. I noticed a piece of paper stuck under my windshield wiper when I got close. It was one of those bright yellow flyers, the kind you'd expect to see for a car wash or some event. At first, I didn't even think it was odd. People leave stuff like that all the time. I set my bags in the back seat and walked around to grab the flyer. It was stuck under the wiper pretty good, so I had to tug at it. While I was pulling it free, I heard footsteps behind me. Not the kind you hear from far away, but close, too close. I froze for a second, just holding the flyer, and then I turned my head. There was a man standing there, maybe a few feet away. He wasn't holding anything, didn't look like he worked there, and he didn't say anything right away. He just stood there, staring at me. He looked normal enough, jeans, a jacket, dark hair, but something about the way he was standing made me feel like I was in trouble. "Hey," he said finally, his voice calm but low. "You need help with something?" I shook my head. "No, I'm good. Thanks." My voice came out steadier than I felt, but my heart was starting to race. He wasn't smiling or anything, just looking at me like he was waiting for something. I tried to brush it off, turned back to my car, and tossed the flyer into the passenger seat. When I reached for the door handle, I felt his hand grab my arm. Not rough, but firm, like he'd done it before. My first instinct was to pull away, but he was strong. "You're coming with me," he said. Still calm, still too quiet. His tone made my stomach turn. "No, I'm not," I managed to say, yanking harder. I was starting to panic now, and my mind was racing. He didn't look angry or frustrated, just determined. Like he already knew how this was going to go. I didn't even see the van until he started pulling me toward it. It was parked just a few spaces down from my car, one of those older white ones with no windows in the back. The kind you see on TV and know to avoid. My heart was pounding so hard I thought I might faint, but I knew I couldn't let him get me in that van. I screamed. Loud. As loud as I could. I didn't care who heard, I just needed someone to notice. He didn't flinch, just kept pulling me toward the van like my screaming didn't matter. That scared me more than anything because it felt like he'd done this before, like he knew how to handle it. I kicked at him, struggled, tried to twist free, but his grip didn't loosen. He was dragging me now, my feet barely staying under me. The van's side door was open, and I could see the inside, a mess of blankets, rope, and something that looked like duct tape. My mind was screaming at me to fight harder, but I felt so weak, like I wasn't strong enough to stop him. Then I remembered my keys. They were in my pocket, and I reached for them blindly, my fingers shaking so much it took me a second to get them out. I didn't think, just swung my arm and jabbed the sharp end of the key into his hand as hard as I could. He yelled. For the first time, he made a noise, and his grip loosened just enough for me to wrench free. I stumbled backward, almost falling, but I caught myself and ran. I didn't look back, didn't even think. I just ran toward the store, where I could see people coming in and out. I was yelling for help, my voice shaking, and a couple of people turned to look. A man near the entrance came toward me, asking what was wrong. I tried to explain, but I could barely get the words out. He tried to grab me. Over there. By my car. The guy didn't hesitate. He turned and started walking toward the parking lot, yelling something like, "Hey, you stay there." I followed behind him, but when we got back to my car, the man and the van were gone. My groceries were still in the back seat, my keys on the ground where I dropped them. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely pick them up. The guy who'd come to help me stayed with me until the police arrived. I filed a report, told them everything I could remember, but they didn't seem too hopeful. They said they'd checked the security cameras, but I haven't heard anything back yet. I still don't know who he was or why he picked me. All I know is that I've never been so scared in my life, and I'll never park in the back of a lot again. I still don't know how I made such a stupid mistake. I was tired, distracted, and not paying attention. I don't have a good excuse, but that's what happened. I live in a big apartment complex, the kind where all the hallways look the same, and late at night, it's easy to get turned around. I had been out running errands, came home, and walked up the wrong flight of stairs. I thought I was on my floor, but I wasn't. When I got to what I thought was my apartment, the door was cracked open. Not wide, just enough to make me stop for a second. I remember thinking maybe I hadn't pulled it shut all the way when I left. That happens sometimes, right? I pushed it open and stepped inside without really thinking. The place was dark except for a faint glow from the living room. I could see the TV was on but muted, playing one of those news channels. The layout was the same as mine, living room straight ahead, kitchen to the left, but something felt off. It smelled different, for one thing. Not bad, just not familiar. I called out, "Hello?" My voice sounded strange in the quiet, like it didn't belong there. No answer. I figured maybe my roommate had left the TV on and gone to bed. That's when I started to notice little details. The furniture wasn't arranged like mine. There was a coat on the back of the couch I didn't recognize. A pair of boots by the door, not mine, not my roommate's. I froze. This wasn't my apartment. My stomach dropped, and I felt this wave of embarrassment hit me. I thought, oh God, I walked into someone else's place. I turned around, ready to bolt back out the door, but before I could move, I heard the lock click. Someone was standing there, just inside the door. I hadn't even heard them come in. It was a man, tall, mid-30s maybe, wearing a heavy jacket like he'd just come in from outside. He was holding a grocery bag in one hand, but he wasn't looking at it. He was looking at me. "What are you doing in here?" he said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, like he was waiting for me to say the wrong thing. I'm sorry," I stammered. "I think I made a mistake. I thought this was my apartment." I tried to move toward the door, but he didn't step aside. He just stood there, staring at me, and then he set the grocery bag down slowly, deliberately, like he had all the time in the world. "You thought this was your apartment?" he repeated. His tone didn't change, but his eyes stayed locked on mine. "That's what you're going with?" "Yes," I said. My voice felt weak, like it wasn't carrying the words right. "I live upstairs. I must have gotten off on the wrong floor. I'm really sorry. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached behind him and slid the deadbolt shut. The sound of it snapping into place made my heart jump. Then why didn't you leave when you realized it wasn't yours? He asked. I was about to, I said quickly. I swear, I just realized. Don't lie to me, he cut in. His voice wasn't calm anymore. It was sharp, almost angry, but still quiet. He took a step closer, and I stepped back without thinking. My heel hit the edge of a coffee table, and I nearly tripped. I'm not lying, I said. My voice cracked, and I hated how scared I sounded. I swear, it was just a mistake. Please, I'll leave right now. He didn't move for a moment, just kept staring at me. Then he nodded slowly, like he was thinking something over. Okay, he said. If it was just a mistake, let's talk about it. Sit down. I don't need to sit down, I said, trying to sound calm. I'll just sit down. It wasn't a request. He wasn't yelling, but the way he said it left no room for argument. I sat on the couch, my hands shaking, and he stayed standing, just watching me. What's your name? He asked. I told him. My voice felt so small in the silence. And you live upstairs? Yes, I said. Just one floor up. What's your apartment number? I told him, hoping he'd believe me, hoping he'd let me leave. He nodded again, slowly, like he was filing the information away. You know, he said, people don't just walk into the wrong apartment. Not by accident. It was an accident, I said, my voice shaking. I swear. I wasn't paying attention. He tilted his head, studying me like he was trying to decide if I was worth believing. Then he stepped closer, leaning down so we were at eye level. Do you know how many break-ins happen in this building? He asked. His voice was low, almost a whisper. Do you know what people like you do when they think no one's home? I'm not a thief, I said quickly. I promise, I'm not. You think I don't know what you're doing? He interrupted. You think I don't see it? I didn't know what to say. My throat felt dry, and my chest was tight. I wanted to get up, to push past him and run, but I didn't dare move. He stood there for what felt like forever, just staring at me. Then he reached into his pocket, and my stomach dropped. I thought he was going to pull out a weapon, but instead, he took out his phone. He held it up, like he was going to call someone. I should call the cops, he said. Please don't, I said, my voice breaking. I didn't do anything. I swear. It was just a mistake. He stared at me for another long moment, then lowered the phone. Get out, he said. I didn't wait for him to say it again. I got up and moved toward the door as fast as I could without running. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely unlock the deadbolt. I felt his eyes on me the whole time. When I finally got the door open, I stepped out into the hallway and turned back. He was still standing there, watching me, his face completely unreadable. He didn't say anything else, just stood there until I closed the door behind me. I ran up the stairs to my actual apartment and locked the door the second I was inside. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and my heart felt like it was going to explode. I didn't sleep that night or the night after. Every time I close my eyes, I see his face. I don't know what he thought I was doing or why he let me go, but I haven't been able to stop thinking about it. It happened on a stretch of highway I've driven more times than I can count. It's one of those roads that feels endless, surrounded by flat fields, no landmarks, nothing to break the monotony. The kind of road where the sky feels too big, and you start counting the minutes until you're off it. It was late, maybe 10 or 11 at night. I was driving back from visiting a friend a couple of towns over. I had the radio low and the windows cracked open to keep myself awake. There weren't many cars out, just me, the occasional truck, and a dark sky that felt heavier than usual. At first, I didn't notice the car behind me. It was just headlights in the distance, blending in like they always do. But after a while, I realized they weren't getting any closer or farther away. They stayed there, hanging back at the same distance no matter how much I sped up or slowed down. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe they were just keeping a steady pace, like I was. But the more I watched them in the rearview mirror, the more I felt like something was off. Every time I switched lanes, they did the same, like they were copying me. I decided to test it. I slowed down, almost to a crawl for the highway, to see if they would pass me. They didn't. Instead, they slowed down too, keeping the same distance. My heart started to pick up then. I wasn't scared yet, but I was definitely on edge. I tried to shake them off by speeding up again, going a little faster than I was comfortable with. For a second, I thought it worked. Their headlights faded back a little, and I thought they finally decided to stop tailing me. But then, they sped up too, closing the gap. That was when I knew something was wrong. This wasn't normal. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe they were just heading the same direction, and I was overthinking it. But deep down, I didn't believe that. I glanced at the GPS and saw there was an exit coming up in a couple of miles. It wasn't the one I needed, but I decided to take it anyway. If they followed me, I'd know for sure. The exit was one of those lonely off-ramps that dumps you onto a smaller road surrounded by nothing but darkness. As I took the turn, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, hoping to see them continue down the highway. They didn't. The car followed me, turning onto the same road. That was when the fear really hit me. My hands felt slick on the steering wheel, and my chest was tight. I didn't know what they wanted, but I knew it wasn't good. The smaller road was even emptier than the highway. No streetlights, no cars, just a faint glow of my headlights and theirs. I thought about pulling over to let them pass, but something about the way they were driving made me think that wasn't a good idea. I kept going, trying to stay calm and think straight. The car behind me started getting closer, their headlights brighter in my mirror. I could feel the tension in my shoulders, my whole body bracing for something. Then, out of nowhere, they sped up and swerved into the next lane, coming up beside me. I glanced over and saw a man in the driver's seat. I couldn't make out much, just a shadowy figure with one hand on the wheel, staring straight ahead. He didn't look at me, but the way his car drifted closer to mine felt deliberate. He was trying to push me off the road. Panic set in. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying to keep my car steady as he kept edging closer. I honked my horn, hoping it would scare him off or at least make him back off. It didn't. He stayed right there, his car inches from mine, forcing me toward the shoulder. I tried to speed up, but he matched my pace. I couldn't go any faster without losing control. My car started to drift toward the gravel at the side of the road, and I felt the tires start to slip. I swerved back into the lane, barely missing him, and he fell back for a moment. I thought maybe he'd given up, but then he was right there again, this time coming up behind me. His headlights filled my mirrors, blinding me, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears. I didn't know what to do. There were no other cars around, no gas stations or stores, nothing but darkness and an endless road. I kept driving, hoping to see some kind of sign or turnoff where I could get away. Then I saw it, a narrow side road coming up on the left. It wasn't marked, just a gap in the trees that looked like it might go somewhere. I didn't have a plan, but I took it. I yanked the wheel and turned hard, the tires screeching as I veered off the main road. The side road was rough, gravel kicking up under my tires, but I kept going. I glanced in the mirror and saw the other car hesitate for a second before following me. My heart sank. He wasn't giving up. The road twisted and turned, narrowing as it went. I couldn't go as fast as I wanted without risking a crash. The other car stayed close, his headlights bouncing in my mirror, but he wasn't trying to push me anymore. I wondered if he was waiting for me to make a mistake, to slow down or stop. Then I saw it, a small clearing up ahead with a cluster of houses. Relief flooded me. I didn't care whose house it was. I just needed to get to where someone could see me. I gunned the engine and pulled into the driveway of the first house I saw, slamming the brakes and throwing the car into park. The other car stopped at the edge of the clearing, just sitting there with its headlights on. I jumped out of my car and ran to the front door of the house, banging on it and yelling for help. It felt like an eternity before someone answered. An older man opened the door, looking confused and alarmed. I barely managed to get the words out, telling him someone was following me, trying to run me off the road. He stepped outside and looked toward the driveway, but the car was gone. I stood there, shaking and trying to catch my breath, while he called the police. They came and took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do. I didn't get a good look at the driver, and there were no cameras on the road where it happened. I don't drive that stretch of highway at night anymore. I don't know who he was or what he wanted, but I can't stop thinking about how deliberate it all felt. He wasn't just messing around. He was trying to scare me, or worse. It was a normal Friday night. I had been in my dorm all day, catching up on assignments and half watching a movie in the background. Around 6, I posted a picture of my dinner, just some takeout from the cafeteria, and tagged the location. It wasn't something I thought twice about. Everyone does it, right? After that, I settled in to finish a paper that was due on Monday. My roommate was out for the weekend visiting family, so I had the place to myself. It was quiet, and I liked it that way. It was around 10 when I heard the knock on the door. It startled me because I wasn't expecting anyone, and people usually text before they come by. I got up, thinking it might be someone from my floor, but when I opened the door, I didn't recognize the person standing there. He was tall, maybe late 20s or early 30s, with dark hair and a jacket that looked a little too heavy for the mild weather. He smiled at me like he knew me, but I had no idea who he was. "Hey," he said. "It's good to see you. It's been a while." I stared at him, confused. "I'm sorry, do I know you?" His smile faltered for a second, but he recovered quickly. "Yeah, we met at that thing last month. You probably don't remember. There were a lot of people there." I shook my head. "I think you have the wrong person." No, he said, laughing a little. "It's definitely you. You're my name, right?" Hearing my name come out of his mouth made my stomach twist. I nodded slowly, trying to figure out if I was forgetting something. Maybe we had met somewhere, but he didn't look familiar at all. "See," he said, like that proved his point. "I knew it was you. Mind if I come in? It's a little cold out here." That's when the alarm bells started going off. I didn't know this guy, and something about him felt off. I kept the door halfway closed and said, "I'm sorry, but I don't think I know you. Where did we meet again?" His smile tightened, Like I said, at that thing last month. Look, it doesn't matter. I just thought I'd stop by since I was in the area. I glanced down the hallway. It was empty. Most people on my floor had gone out for the weekend, and the few who stayed were probably in their rooms with the doors closed. I was suddenly very aware of how quiet it was. "I'm sorry," I said again. "I think you might have the wrong person." His expression changed then. The friendly, casual demeanor slipped away, and he frowned, like he was annoyed. "Come on," he said. "Don't be like that. I came all the way here." I tightened my grip on the door, not opening it any further. "I think you should leave." He didn't move. His eyes narrowed, and he took a step closer to the door frame. "You posted you were here," he said. "Why would you do that if you didn't want people to know?" My stomach dropped. That's when it clicked. The picture I posted earlier. I had tagged my location, my dorm building. I hadn't thought twice about it at the time, but now it felt like the stupidest thing I'd ever done. "I'm going to call campus security," I said, trying to sound confident even though my voice was shaking. "You need to leave." He smirked. "You don't need to do that. I'm just trying to be friendly. You don't have to make this a big deal." "It's already a big deal," I said. "Leave. Now." He didn't move for a second, and I thought he might try to force his way in. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. Then he shrugged and stepped back, holding his hands up like he was giving up. "Fine," he said. "Whatever. I was just trying to be nice." I didn't respond. I closed the door and locked it as fast as I could, then stood there, listening. For a few seconds, I didn't hear anything, but then there was the sound of footsteps walking away. I peeked through the peephole and saw him heading down the hallway. I stayed by the door for a long time after that, listening and waiting. I didn't know if he was really gone or if he was just trying to make me think he was. I didn't hear anything else, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still nearby. After what felt like forever, I called campus security. I told them what happened, and they sent someone to check the building. They didn't find him, but they said they'd keep an eye out. They also told me to report it to the police, which I did the next day. I didn't sleep that night. Every little sound made me jump, and I kept thinking about how easily he found me. All it took was one post, one stupid little tag, and he knew exactly where I was. I don't post my location anymore. I don't even post pictures until hours after I've left a place. I don't know what he wanted or what he would have done if I had let him in, but I'm glad I didn't find out. I keep thinking about how insistent he was, how he acted like he had a right to be there. It wasn't just creepy. It was terrifying. It was late, later than I meant for it to be. I had been driving for hours, trying to get home from visiting my sister. The highway felt endless, and I was running on fumes literally and figuratively. When I saw the gas station sign, I almost felt relieved. It was one of those small, out-of-the-way places, just a few pumps in a little building with flickering lights, but it was the only thing around for miles. I pulled in, parked next to one of the pumps, and went inside to pay. The place was empty except for the guy behind the counter, a younger guy who barely looked up from his phone when I walked in. I told him I needed to fill up and asked if they had a restroom. He nodded toward the back and muttered something about a key. There wasn't anyone else in the store, so I grabbed the key hanging on the hook by the counter and headed to the restroom. The door was one of those heavy, industrial ones, with peeling paint and a rusty lock. Inside, The place was as bad as you'd expect: dirty tiles, a flickering light, and a smell that made me want to hold my breath. But I didn't have a choice. I had to go. I was quick, trying to touch as little as possible. When I finished, I washed my hands and dried them on my jeans because the paper towel dispenser was empty. Then I went to leave. The door wouldn't open. At first, I thought maybe the lock was jammed. I tried turning the handle again, harder this time, but it didn't budge. I checked the lock itself, twisting it back and forth, but it was already unlocked. That's when I realized the problem wasn't the lock. The door was being held shut from the outside. I knocked, then banged on the door. Hello? Hey. The door stuck. My voice echoed in the tiny space, but there was no answer. I waited, listening. I thought maybe the guy at the counter would come check, but it was dead silent. I banged again, harder this time, and yelled, "Can someone open the door?" Nothing. My heart started to race. I tried to think logically. Maybe the door was heavy, and it got stuck somehow. Maybe the guy at the counter didn't hear me. But then I remembered how quiet it was in the store when I walked in. He had to have heard me. I pulled out my phone to call the gas station, but there was no signal. Just a spinning wheel where the bars should have been. I tried moving around the tiny room, holding the phone up, but it didn't make a difference. I was completely cut off. Panic started creeping in, but I told myself to stay calm. I knocked again, softer this time, hoping someone passing by might hear me. Hello? Can someone let me out? The door stuck. My voice sounded shaky now, and hearing it like that made the panic worse. I pressed my ear to the door, trying to hear anything on the other side. At first, there was nothing but the faint hum of fluorescent lights. Then I heard something, a shuffling sound, like footsteps. Relief flooded me. Hey! I'm stuck in here. Can you open the door? The footsteps stopped. I waited, expecting to hear the scrape of the lock or the door handle turning, but nothing happened. Hello? I called again. The silence felt heavier now, pressing against me. Then the footsteps started again, slower this time, moving away from the door. Wait. Don't leave. I yelled, banging on the door again. But whoever it was, they were gone. I felt trapped in every sense of the word. The tiny bathroom felt smaller with each passing second, and the silence outside made it worse. I tried to think of a way out. The window was too high and too small to climb through, and the walls were solid concrete. There was no way out except the door. I don't know how long I waited, but eventually, I heard something again. A faint creak, like the sound of a door opening. My heart leapt. Maybe the guy from the counter had finally realized what happened. I pressed my ear to the door again, straining to hear. Hello? I called, but my voice sounded weak now. The footsteps were back, heavier this time, and getting closer. They stopped just outside the door. My breath caught in my throat. Is someone there? For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, so quiet I almost didn't hear it, there was a soft tap on the other side of the door. Just one deliberate knock. I stumbled back, my chest tight and my pulse racing. Who's there? I tried to sound firm, but my voice cracked. Let me out. No response. The knock didn't come again. I stared at the door, my mind racing. Whoever was out there wasn't trying to help me. They were toying with me. I fumbled with my phone again, praying for a signal, but it was useless. The spinning wheel taunted me, and I felt the weight of the situation pressing down. I was trapped, completely at the mercy of whoever was on the other side. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the door. It felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. Then, just when I thought they might have left, the doorknob turned. It moved slowly, the sound of metal against metal sending a chill through me. I held my breath, frozen in place. The door opened just a crack, enough for me to see a sliver of the dimly lit hallway beyond. "Who are you?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The door didn't open any further, but it didn't close either. I couldn't see anyone on the other side, just the empty space beyond the crack. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. Then, suddenly, the door slammed shut. The sound was deafening in the small space, and I stumbled back, hitting the sink. My hands were shaking, and I felt tears sting my eyes. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew I couldn't stay in there. I don't know where I found the strength, but I ran to the door and pounded on it with everything I had. "Let me out!" I screamed over and over again. "Let me out!" And then, as suddenly as it started, the door opened. It didn't creak this time. It just swung open, revealing the empty hallway beyond. There was no one there. I didn't think. I just ran. I didn't even stop to look at the counter as I bolted out of the gas station and into my car. The pump was still in my tank, the meter frozen mid-fill, but I didn't care. I yanked it out, threw it onto the ground, and sped away. I didn't stop until I was miles down the road, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I still don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I know one thing: I'll never stop at a gas station that isolated again. I was driving through a small town on my way to a work event when it started raining so hard that I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. It was late, and I had been on the road all day, so I decided to pull over and find a place to stay for the night. There was a little motel just off the highway, the kind with the neon vacancy sign buzzing in the window. It looked old, but it was clean enough, and I wasn't in the mood to keep searching. The guy at the front desk was an older man, polite but distracted, like he had been watching TV in the back and didn't really want to deal with me. I gave him my information, and he handed me a key. Room 12. It was on the second floor, at the far end of the balcony that overlooked the parking lot. The rain hadn't let up, so I grabbed my bag and jogged up the stairs. When I reached the door, I could see the room number printed on the little plaque next to it. I slid the key into the lock, turned the knob, and pushed the door open. At first, I thought the room was empty. It was dark, and the heavy curtains were drawn shut. I flipped the light switch, and the lamp on the bedside table flickered to life. That's when I saw him. There was a man sitting in the chair near the window, partially hidden by the shadow from the curtain. He wasn't moving. He was just sitting there, watching me. For a moment, I thought I had walked into the wrong room, but then I looked down at the key in my hand. Room 12. I hadn't made a mistake. "Ah, sorry," I said, stepping back toward the door. "I think there's been a mix-up." The man didn't respond. He just stared at me. He was wearing a jacket, even though it was warm in the room, and his hands were resting on the arms of the chair like he was waiting for something. His eyes didn't leave mine, and the longer I stood there, the more uncomfortable I felt. "I'll go check with the front desk," I said, backing out of the room. I closed the door behind me and stood in the hallway for a moment, trying to calm down. It was probably just a mistake. Maybe the front desk had double-booked a room or something. I walked back down to the office, my heart still racing. The guy behind the desk looked up from the TV when I walked in. problem?" he asked. "There's someone in my room," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Room 12. He frowned and checked the computer. "No, there shouldn't be. That's your room." "Well, there's a guy in there," I said. "He's just sitting in the chair." The man behind the counter gave me a skeptical look. "Are you sure?" "Yes, I'm sure," I said. "Can you check again?" He sighed and typed something into the computer. "Nope, it's just you. No one else has checked into that room." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. "You don't understand. I saw him. He's in there." "Look," he said, standing up. "I'll come with you, but I think you're mistaken." We walked back up to the room together. The rain was still pounding on the roof, and the balcony was slick with water. When we reached the door, the man unlocked it and pushed it open. The room was empty. The chair by the window was turned toward the wall, and there was no sign that anyone had been there. No jacket, no bags, nothing. It was just a plain, empty room. "I don't know what to tell you," the man said. "There's no one here." I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew what I saw. The man had been sitting there, staring at me, as real as the rain falling outside. "I'm not imagining this," I said. He was here. The front desk guy just shrugged. "Maybe you're tired. It's been a long day, right? Get some rest." He left before I could argue, closing the door behind him. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty chair. I didn't feel tired. I felt wide awake, my senses heightened by the unease crawling through me. I locked the door and double-checked it, then went into the bathroom to splash water on my face. When I came out, I froze. The chair by the window had moved. It was now facing the middle of the room. I tried to tell myself it must have been like that all along, that I just hadn't noticed, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my bag and pulled out my phone. No signal. I hadn't even thought to check before, but now it felt like a cruel joke. There was a knock at the door. I turned toward it, my heart pounding. "Who is it?" I called out. No answer. I took a step closer, my hand hovering over the doorknob. "Who's there?" Still nothing. I looked through the peephole, but all I could see was darkness. It was like someone was covering it from the outside. My breath caught in my throat, and I stumbled back. The knocking came again, louder this time. I didn't know what to do. I felt trapped, like a mouse in a cage. I grabbed the chair and wedged it under the doorknob, then backed away toward the bed. The knocking stopped, and for a moment, everything was silent except for the sound of the rain. Then I heard the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving down the hallway outside. They stopped right in front of my door, and I could hear breathing, heavy and uneven, just on the other side. I don't know how long I stood there, clutching my phone like it was some kind of weapon. Eventually, the footsteps moved away, and the breathing faded. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed awake, sitting on the bed, my back against the wall, watching the door. When morning finally came, I grabbed my stuff and left as quickly as I could. The guy at the front desk didn't even look up as I dropped off the key. I didn't say anything to him. I just got in my car and drove away, not stopping until I was hours down the road. I don't know who that man was or how he got into the room. I don't know if it was some kind of mistake or something worse. All I know is that I'll never forget the way he looked at me, like he knew something I didn't. Like he was waiting for me to let my guard down. I take my dog, Riley, out for a walk every night after dinner. It's just a habit, something to help wind down the day. Riley's a big mutt, mostly lab with something else mixed in, and he's full of energy. The neighborhood's quiet in the evenings, and I like the peace of it. That night, the air was crisp, and the sidewalks were mostly empty. The streetlights cast long shadows, and the occasional hum of a passing car was the only sound besides Riley's paws on the pavement. We were about 20 minutes into the walk, just coming up on a small park a few blocks from my house, when I saw another dog walker heading toward us. He had a medium-sized dog, something fluffy and light-colored, and he waved as he got closer. I nodded back out of politeness. When we got within a few feet of each other, he stopped, pulling his dog to a halt. Riley, being friendly as always, wagged his tail and sniffed in their direction. "Nice dog," the guy said. His voice was cheerful, maybe too much so, but I figured he was just being friendly. "Thanks," I said, not wanting to linger. "What breed is he?" he asked. "Not sure," I replied. "Some kind of mix. Looks strong. Protective, huh?" I shrugged, giving a quick tug on Riley's leash to signal we should keep moving. "He's a good dog." The guy took a small step closer. "What's his name?" "Riley," I said, glancing around. The street was empty, and the park up ahead was dark except for the faint glow of a distant lamppost. "Riley," he repeated, smiling. "I like that. How old is he?" "5, I said, keeping my answer short. I didn't want to be rude, but something about the way he was standing, the way his dog seemed almost secondary to him, made me uneasy. "You live around here?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "Yeah, nearby," I said, not offering more. He nodded, still smiling. "I walk my dog here every night." "Never seen you before." I didn't respond to that. Instead, I gave Riley's leash another gentle pull, turning slightly to indicate I was ready to keep moving. The man didn't take the hint. "You usually walk this late?" he asked, stepping to the side just enough to block my path. It wasn't overt, but it was clear he was trying to keep me there. "Sometimes," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "We should get going. Have a good night." He didn't move. Instead, he leaned down and gave Riley a quick pat on the head. Riley, usually cautious around strangers, tensed slightly, and his tail stopped wagging. That was the first real sign that something was off. "Where do you live?" the man asked, his voice still friendly but with an edge I couldn't place. "Not far," I said, stepping to the side to go around him. He shifted too, keeping himself between me and the path forward. "Got a family?" "Wife." "Kids?" That did it. My stomach tightened, and I felt a bead of sweat form at the back of my neck despite the cool air. "Why do you need to know that?" I asked, my voice firm now. He laughed, a short, dry sound. "Just making conversation. People around here can be so unfriendly." I didn't reply. I tugged on Riley's leash and took a deliberate step forward. This time, the man didn't move out of the way. Instead, he planted his feet and tilted his head, like he was sizing me up. "You in a hurry?" he asked, his tone shifting slightly, less friendly now. "Yeah," I said, meeting his gaze. "It's late." His smile faded, and for a moment, he just stood there, watching me. Riley crawled softly, a low rumble I'd never heard from him before. "You know," the man said, almost casually, "it's not smart to walk alone at night. You never know who you might run into." My heart was pounding now, but I forced myself to stay calm. "Thanks for the advice," I said, stepping to the side again. This time, I moved quickly, pulling Riley with me and putting some distance between us. The man didn't follow at first, but I could feel his eyes on me as I walked away. I kept my pace steady, not wanting to seem panicked, but every instinct in me was screaming to run. When I glanced back over my shoulder, he was standing in the same spot, watching me. His dog was sitting calmly by his side, like none of this was out of the ordinary. I turned forward again and focused on getting to the park's exit. That's when I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. The rhythm of the steps was unmistakable, faster now, closing the gap. Riley growled again, louder this time, and I tightened my grip on his leash. "Hey," the man called out, his voice sharp now, no trace of the earlier friendliness. "I wasn't done talking to you." I ignored him and quickened my pace. The exit was just ahead, the glow of a streetlight marking the edge of the park. "Hey," he shouted again, closer now. I turned my head slightly, just enough to see him out of the corner of my eye. He was walking fast, his dog trailing behind him. His face was hard to read in the dim light, but his body language was tense, aggressive. When I reached the street, I broke into a jog. Riley matched my pace, his ears pinned back. I could hear the man behind me, his footsteps pounding against the pavement. I didn't stop until I reached a house with its porch light on. I turned into the driveway, hoping the sight of someone's home would make him back off. Riley barked sharply, and I spun around, ready to confront him if I had to. But he was gone. The sidewalk was empty, the park behind me silent except for the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I waited for a few minutes, my chest heaving, my eyes scanning every shadow. There was no sign of him. I took a deep breath, adjusted Riley's leash, and made my way home, sticking to the most well-lit streets I could find. I don't know what he wanted or why he was so insistent, but I've changed my walking routine since then. I never go out that late anymore, and I keep a flashlight and pepper spray with me at all times. Riley doesn't wag his tail at strangers like he used to, and I can't say I blame him. The train was almost empty, as it always was this late at night. I had taken this route countless times before, and it usually felt safe enough. Most of the people on the train were either glued to their phones or half asleep, just trying to get home like me. That night, though, something was different. I noticed him about 2 stops after I got on. He was sitting a few rows down, angled just enough that I could see his face clearly. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but every time I glanced in his direction, his eyes were locked on me. He wasn't even pretending to look away. It wasn't like he was staring off into space, it was deliberate. Focused. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was zoning out, or maybe he just had one of those faces that looked intense. I pulled out my phone and started scrolling, hoping to distract myself, but I could still feel his eyes on me. It was like a weight pressing on the back of my neck. A few minutes passed, and I risked another glance. He was still staring, his expression unreadable. He didn't look angry or friendly, just focused. It wasn't casual, though. It wasn't normal. I decided to move. There was no reason to sit there feeling uncomfortable when the car behind me was empty. At the next stop, I stood up and walked quickly to the next set of doors. As I stepped into the other car, I glanced back. He was still sitting there, his eyes following me the entire time. The new car was almost completely empty, just a young couple near the back who looked like they were coming back from a night out. I sat down closer to the front, near the door, and tried to shake off the feeling. Maybe he wasn't following me. Maybe it was all in my head. A minute later, I heard the door behind me slide open. I didn't turn around. I didn't have to. I could feel it, the way the air seemed to shift, the way my skin prickled. He had followed me. He sat down in the same row as me, just on the opposite side of the aisle. Close enough that I could see him in my peripheral vision, but not close enough that it felt like an immediate threat. Still, it was deliberate. It had to be. My heart was pounding now. I stared out the window, pretending to be engrossed in the darkness rushing past, but all I could think about was him. Why was he following me? What did he want? At the next stop, I stood up again. I didn't look at him. I didn't want to give him any excuse to interact with me. I walked calmly to the door, stepped out onto the platform, and crossed to the next car. The train was still stopped, the doors still open. I glanced back, hoping, praying that he would stay where he was. He didn't. I saw him step off the train just as the doors were starting to close. For a second, I thought maybe he was leaving, but then he darted toward the door of the car I had just entered. He made it through just before it shut. I felt trapped. My mind was racing, trying to figure out what to do. There weren't many people around. Just a handful of passengers scattered throughout the car. None of them seemed to notice what was happening. Or if they did, they didn't care. I sat down near the door, clutching my bag tightly. He didn't sit this time. He stood, leaning against the pole in the middle of the car, staring at me like it was the most natural thing in the world. His eyes were dark, unblinking. I couldn't stay on the train with him. I had to get off. But if I got off, would he follow me again? What if no one else got off at the same stop? What if it was just the two of us? The next stop was coming up. I stood up before the train even began to slow, hoping to make it look like I had been planning to get off all along. When the doors opened, I stepped out quickly, walking briskly toward the escalators without looking back. I could hear footsteps behind me. Heavy, deliberate. He wasn't trying to be subtle anymore. The platform was nearly empty. I saw a man in a reflective vest, a worker, probably, and I headed straight for him. I didn't care if I looked paranoid. I just needed to get away from this guy. "Excuse me," I said, my voice shaky. "Can you tell me where the nearest exit is?" The worker looked up from whatever he was doing and gave me a quick nod. "Just up the escalator, to your right." I glanced back, and the man who had been following me had stopped a few feet away, standing still in the middle of the platform. He wasn't looking at the worker. He was looking at me. His expression hadn't changed. I thanked the worker and hurried to the escalator. My heart was racing so hard I thought I might pass out. I didn't look back again until I was outside, standing in the cold air under the harsh glow of a streetlight. He wasn't there. I stood there for a few minutes, trying to catch my breath. The streets were quiet, but there were a few people around, enough to make me feel somewhat safe. I called a rideshare and stayed under the streetlight until it arrived, keeping my eyes on the station entrance the entire time. The man never came out. I don't know if he stayed on the platform or got back on the train, but I didn't see him again. I've taken that route since then, but only during the day. And I don't sit near the doors anymore. I don't let my guard down. Not after that. When I bought my house, I was excited but nervous. It was my first home, and I knew there'd be a lot to learn. The neighborhood seemed nice enough, quiet, mostly older folks, nothing that stood out in a bad way. It felt like a good place to start fresh. I had only been there a few days when my neighbor introduced himself. His name was Dan. He came over while I was trying to figure out how to use the lawnmower that the previous owners had left behind. He was in his late 50s, maybe early 60s, with a weathered face and a permanent smile. He carried a wrench in one hand, as if he had been in the middle of fixing something when he decided to come over. "Looks like you're figuring things out," he said, nodding at the mower. "Those older models can be tricky." I explained that it was my first time owning a house and that I wasn't great with tools. He offered to take a look at the mower, and within a few minutes, he had it running. I was grateful and thanked him more than once. He waved it off, saying he was happy to help. Over the next few weeks, Dan came by every so often. At first, it was always under the pretense of helping with something, tightening a loose faucet, showing me how to patch a small hole in the fence. He seemed like the kind of neighbor you'd be lucky to have. But then he started coming over just to chat. I didn't mind at first. I figured he was lonely or just friendly. But as time went on, his visits became more frequent. I'd hear his voice calling out from the yard while I was inside, or I'd see him standing at the edge of my property, looking over like he was about to walk in. He'd make comments about how quiet my place was or how I hadn't put up curtains yet. One day, I came home from work and found him in my backyard. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there. When I asked what he was doing, he smiled and said he noticed my gutter was sagging and thought he'd check it out for me. I hadn't asked him to, and I didn't even realize it needed fixing. I thanked him but told him I'd take care of it. He didn't seem offended, but there was a pause, a moment where he just stared at me, like he was trying to figure something out. Then he smiled again and said, "No problem." That was when I started feeling uneasy. I didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but I also didn't like the idea of someone coming into my yard without asking. I told myself he was just being helpful, maybe a little too eager. A week later, I woke up to the sound of someone knocking on my door. It was still early, barely light out. When I looked through the peephole, it was Dan. I didn't open the door right away. He was holding something, tools, I think, and when I asked what he needed, he said he noticed my porch light was flickering the night before and thought he'd fix it. I told him I was fine and that I'd handle it later. He stood there for a moment before walking away, but something about the way he moved felt wrong. Like he was annoyed but didn't want to show it. After that, I started locking everything. I had been lazy about it before since it felt like such a safe neighborhood, but now I made sure every window and door was secure before I went to bed. I even put a lock on the gate to my backyard. One night, I was in the living room when I heard a noise outside. It wasn't loud, just a faint scraping sound. I turned off the TV and listened. It was coming from the back door. My heart was pounding as I got up and walked over. When I looked through the small window, I saw the handle move, like someone was trying to open it. I didn't know what to do. I was frozen, just staring at the door. Then I heard a voice, Dan's voice. He called my name, quiet at first, then louder. "I know you're in there. Just wanted to see if you needed help with anything." I didn't answer. I backed away from the door and grabbed my phone, ready to call the police. But then he stopped. The handle stopped moving, and I heard his footsteps walking away. I didn't sleep that night. I kept looking out the windows, half expecting to see him standing there. The next morning, I found a screwdriver lying on my back porch, right near the door. I wanted to confront him, but I was scared. What if he got angry? What if it made things worse? Instead, I started looking into security systems. I bought cameras and installed one on the front porch and another in the backyard. The cameras made me feel a little better, but not completely. I was still on edge, still jumping at every sound. Then, a few nights later, I saw him on the camera feed. He was standing at my back gate, testing the lock. When he realized it was locked, he looked straight into the camera. He didn't smile. He didn't move. He just stared for what felt like forever before walking away. That was it for me. I called the police and told them everything. They came out and talked to him, but all he said was that he was trying to be helpful, that he didn't mean any harm. He promised to leave me alone, and for a while, he did. But I still see him sometimes. He stands at the edge of his property, watching me. He doesn't come over anymore, doesn't try to talk to me, but I can feel his eyes on me. I don't think he's forgotten. I don't think he ever will. The hike started out normal. It was me and my best friend, Kevin, on a weekend trip to a national park we've been talking about for months. We planned a 2-night trek through some of the quieter trails. It wasn't supposed to be a big deal, just a way to get away from work and all the noise of daily life. The first day went smooth. We made it to the campsite early, set up the tent, and had plenty of time to relax by the fire. The trail wasn't too crowded, and we only passed a few groups along the way. It felt peaceful, the kind of quiet you don't really get in the city. The second morning, as we were packing up to move to the next site, a group of 4 people came through. 2 guys, 2 women. They looked about our age, maybe a little older. Their gear was worn, like they'd done this kind of thing before, and they were friendly enough at first. One of the guys, tall with a shaved head, called out a greeting, and they stopped to chat. Kevin's always more social than me, so he did most of the talking. They asked where we were headed, how long we'd been out, all the usual stuff. I thought it was fine, but something about the way they kept glancing at our gear put me on edge. Like they were sizing it up. I brushed it off, telling myself I was overthinking. After a few minutes, they said goodbye and continued down the trail. Kevin waved, and we finished packing. It wasn't until we got moving that I realized they were going the same direction we were. We'd catch glimpses of them ahead, their voices carrying through the trees, but we kept our distance. When we reached our next site, they were already there. It wasn't a designated campsite, just a clearing by a stream, but it was big enough for multiple groups. They waved when they saw us, and Kevin waved back. I wasn't thrilled about sharing the space, but it's public land, and we didn't have much choice. As we set up our tent, the group came over again. They were still friendly, offering us some of their trail mix and asking if we needed help with anything. The tall guy, he introduced himself as Jay, even complimented Kevin's tent, saying it looked sturdy. I just nodded along, keeping my answer short. Something about them felt off. Too nice, maybe. Like they were trying too hard. That night, we ate our dinner and sat by our own fire, trying to keep to ourselves. The other group set up a little farther away, but they were loud, laughing and talking like they were at a party. It didn't bother Kevin, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching us. When we woke up the next morning, I found one of our water bottles was missing. I thought maybe Kevin had moved it, but he swore he hadn't touched it. It didn't make sense. We packed everything up before bed. I tried not to jump to conclusions, but I couldn't help thinking about the other group. We packed up and started the last leg of the hike. The trail was harder that day, with more steep climbs and rocky paths. About an hour in, Kevin's bootlace snapped. It wasn't a huge deal, but he swore it had been fine the night before. We stopped so he could fix it, and while we were sitting there, the other group caught up to us. Jay grinned and asked if we needed help again. His tone was casual, but his eyes lingered on our packs, and I felt my skin crawl. One of the women, short, with curly hair offered Tevin some duct tape for his boot. He thanked her, and they moved on, disappearing down the trail. We started walking again, and I kept replaying everything in my head. The missing water bottle. Tevin's bootlace. Little things, but they didn't sit right. I told Tevin, but he shrugged it off, saying I was paranoid. Maybe he was right, but I couldn't relax. Around midday, we stopped for a break at a small clearing. I opened my pack to grab a snack and found my food bag had been opened. Not all of it was gone, but enough to notice. Tevin's bag was untouched, and he looked at me like I was losing it when I pointed it out. Probably a raccoon, he said, brushing crumbs off his pants. But my bag had been inside my pack, zipped up tight. There was no way an animal had gotten to it without making a mess. We kept walking, and the trail got narrower, with thick trees on either side. I started to notice the sounds of footsteps behind us. Light, like someone trying to be quiet. I stopped a few times, pretending to adjust my pack, but I didn't see anyone. Still, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. By late afternoon, we reached the last site. It was more isolated than the others, surrounded by woods on three sides. The stream was dry, which made me even more nervous. We were low on water, thanks to the missing bottle, and the next source was miles away. As we set up camp, I kept scanning the trees, expecting the other group to show up again. They didn't, but the uneasy feeling didn't go away. I told Tevin we should leave, but he laughed, saying I was overreacting. That night, as we were falling asleep, I heard voices outside the tent. Low, murmuring voices, too far away to make out but close enough to know they were there. I shook Tevin awake, but by the time he listened, the voices had stopped. He told me it was just the wind and rolled over. I stayed awake for hours, listening. Around midnight, I heard footsteps again, circling the tent. Slow and deliberate. My heart was pounding, but I didn't move. I didn't want whoever it was to know I was awake. After what felt like forever, the steps faded, and I finally dozed off. When we woke up, the tent stakes were missing. The whole thing had collapsed on one side. Kevin cursed, saying it must have been animals again, but I knew better. Someone had pulled them out while we were sleeping. We packed up in record time and started hiking back toward the car. I felt exposed, like eyes were on us the whole way. Kevin tried to lighten the mood, joking about my wild imagination, but I could tell he was uneasy too. About a mile from the parking lot, we found one of our missing water bottles on the side of the trail. It was empty, the cap lying a few feet away. Kevin stopped laughing after that. We didn't see the other group again, but I couldn't shake the feeling they were watching us, just out of sight. When we finally reached the car, I felt like I could breathe again. We threw our gear in the trunk and didn't stop driving until we were hours away from the park. I don't know what they wanted or why they were messing with us, but I haven't gone camping since. Every time I think about it, I get this sinking feeling, like we barely made it out. Like they were testing how far they could push us. And I don't want to know what would have happened if we hadn't left when we did. When I first found the spot, I thought I'd hit the jackpot. It was a clearing near a small stream, tucked away in the woods about a mile from the nearest trail. It wasn't marked on any maps I had, and it felt like it had been untouched for years. The place was perfect, quiet, peaceful, and far from anyone else. I set up my tent in the middle of the clearing, built a small fire ring with stones, and laid out my gear. The first day was uneventful. I spent the afternoon exploring the area, following the stream upstream until the terrain got too rough, then doubling back. I didn't see a single person or any sign that anyone had been there recently. Just the way I liked it. By the time evening rolled around, I was tired but content. I cooked a quick meal over the fire and watched the sun dip below the trees before crawling into my tent for the night. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of rain tapping on the tent. It wasn't heavy, just a light drizzle, but it made everything damp and a little colder than I'd hoped. I spent most of the morning huddled near the fire, drinking coffee and reading a book I'd brought along. When the rain let up around noon, I decided to stretch my legs and explore some more. I hadn't gone far, maybe 100 yards from camp, when I noticed it. At first, I thought it was just a tree stump, but as I got closer, I realized it was something else. It was a trail camera, strapped to a tree, aimed directly at my campsite. The sight of it made my stomach drop. It hadn't been there the day before, I was sure of it. I'd walked this same area when I was setting up camp, and I would have noticed something like that. The camera was one of those compact ones with camouflage casing, the kind hunters or wildlife researchers use. Its lens was pointed straight at the clearing where my tent stood. I stared at it for a long time, trying to make sense of it. Who had put it there? And why? My first thought was that maybe it was left by a hunter, but it didn't make sense. It was aimed too precisely at my camp. Not at a game trail or a clearing where animals might wander through at me. I looked around, scanning the woods for any sign of someone watching. The trees were thick, the undergrowth dense, but I didn't see anyone. The woods were silent except for the occasional chirp of a bird or the rustle of leaves in the breeze. Still, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I walked back to the camera and stared at it again. I considered taking it down or smashing it, but something stopped me. If someone was watching, would they get angry? Would they come back to check on it and find me here? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I decided to leave it alone for now and head back to camp. My mind was racing with possibilities, none of them good. I told myself I was overreacting, that it was probably nothing. Maybe it had been there the whole time, and I just hadn't noticed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When I got back to camp, I tried to distract myself by packing up some of my gear and tidying up. The clearing felt different now, less like a peaceful retreat and more like a stage with a spotlight on it. I kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting someone to step out at any moment. By the time evening came, I was on edge. I didn't bother starting a fire. I didn't want to draw attention to myself. Instead, I ate some cold food from my pack and sat in the tent, listening to the woods. The rain had started again, heavier this time, and the sound of it hitting the tent drowned out everything else. I don't know how long I sat there before I heard it. It was faint at first, barely audible over the rain, but it was there, the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, crunching through the wet undergrowth. They were coming from the direction of the trail camera. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to be quiet. I grabbed the small pocket knife I kept in my pack, not that it would do much good, and held it tightly. The footsteps stopped just outside the clearing. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my breathing shallow and ragged. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard the sound of something being adjusted. A click, like a latch being undone, followed by the faint rustle of fabric or plastic. They were doing something to the camera. I didn't dare move or make a sound. I stayed perfectly still, gripping the knife so hard my hand hurt. After a few minutes, the footsteps started again, heading back the way they'd come. I waited until the sound faded completely before I let myself breathe. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the tent, listening to every sound, every rustle of leaves or crack of a branch. The rain eventually stopped, leaving the woods eerily quiet. When dawn finally came, I didn't waste any time. I packed up my gear as quickly as I could, constantly glancing over my shoulder. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. I just wanted to get out of there. As I hiked back toward the trailhead, I passed by the tree where the camera had been. It was gone. Whoever had put it there had taken it during the night. I don't know who they were or what they wanted, and I don't want to find out. I haven't been camping since. The woods don't feel the same anymore. They don't feel safe. I've worked the night shift at St. Margaret's Hospital for almost 2 years, and it's never been anything out of the ordinary. Sure, the night shift can be slow, sometimes even eerie, with fewer staff and fewer patients. But you get used to it. The routine, the silence, the dim lighting, all of it. You learn to move through the quiet halls without thinking too much about it. But this past month, something changed. Something that made me start questioning everything. It started with the missing medical records. At first, I thought it was just me being forgetful. I'd file a chart, go back to check on a patient, and then realize I'd left something behind. But over time, it wasn't just 1 or 2 records, it was entire files, crucial ones. The kind you need to monitor a patient's care. Every time I went to grab one, it was gone. I checked the drawers, the filing cabinets, the computer, but nothing. I didn't mention anything at first, thinking maybe someone else had misplaced them, or I had simply put them somewhere without realizing it. But then it started happening with other things. Missing equipment, syringes, medication. It was as though something or someone was taking things. And the weirdest part? Every time I asked my colleagues about it, they seemed just as confused as I was. One night, things took a much darker turn. It was around 3 a.m., a quiet time when most patients were asleep, and there weren't many staff around. I had just checked on the last few rooms of my floor when I noticed that Dr. Patterson, the head of our unit, was walking down the hall. Now, Patterson was a bit of a strange one, distant, always a little too formal, and he never worked nights. He'd always been a day doctor, so it was odd to see him at this hour. Dr. Patterson? I called out as he passed the nurse's station, just to be polite. He stopped for a second, then turned to me with a blank look. "Oh, it's you, Nurse Williams. How's everything tonight?" His voice sounded fine, but there was something off about it, like he wasn't entirely aware of where he was. "It's going all right. Everything under control?" I asked, trying to make conversation. He nodded slowly, almost too slowly. "Yes. Everything is fine. Everything is always fine here." It was a strange thing to say, considering how late it was and how empty the hallways felt. But I didn't think much of it at the time. The next time I saw him, it was a few hours later. I had just finished my rounds and was sitting at the desk, catching up on some paperwork. I heard the sound of footsteps approaching, soft but deliberate. I looked up, expecting to see one of the night staff coming through. But it was Dr. Patterson again, walking with that same eerie calmness, his eyes scanning the hallway as if looking for something or someone. This time, I couldn't help myself. "Dr. Patterson, is everything okay?" I asked, a little too forcefully. He turned to look at me, and his eyes seemed to flicker for a moment, like he wasn't really seeing me. He gave a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Everything is fine. You should check on room 205. The patient in there seems restless," he said. His voice was almost mechanical, like he was repeating something he'd been told to say. I gave him a nod, but something in my gut told me something was very wrong. I wasn't sure why, but I felt an overwhelming urge to check the patient in 205. So I did. When I reached the door, I felt a cold chill. The lights in the room were dimmed, and there was no sound coming from inside. The patient, an elderly woman named Mrs. Hawkins, had been admitted for severe complications due to a stroke. She was never very mobile and often slept through the night. But when I opened the door, she wasn't in the bed. I checked the bathroom. Nothing. I checked under the bed, behind the curtains. Still nothing. But when I looked down at the floor near the window, I saw something strange, a small smear of blood leading from the bed toward the door. Panic set in. I immediately checked the security footage, but the cameras outside the room had been disabled. I felt my pulse quicken. How could the cameras have been turned off? And why would they even be disabled at all? I went straight to the head nurse's office, but she was nowhere to be found. It was just me, and the feeling that something was seriously wrong, and I couldn't shake it. I rushed back to the nurse's station, where I found another nurse, Carla. She looked just as confused as I felt. "I think Dr. Patterson has been doing something to the patients," I said quickly, my voice trembling. "Mrs. Hawkins is missing, and the cameras, Carla, something is wrong." Carla froze, staring at me. "What are you talking about? Are you sure?" "Check room 205, I urged. "I don't think she left on her own. There's blood on the floor, and I can't find her anywhere." She seemed reluctant, but she finally nodded, and we both went to room 205 together. When we got there, we saw the same thing. The room was empty, the bed undisturbed, and the blood smear on the floor. But then, when Carla turned to me, her face paled. "Where is Dr. Patterson?" I looked around. He wasn't there, but I had just seen him a moment ago. I felt a sudden, sharp sense of dread. Carla and I decided to check the hospital's basement. We didn't say a word as we descended the stairs, but the deeper we went, the heavier the air seemed to get. The basement was where all the medical waste and old equipment was stored. It was also the last place I wanted to be at 4 a.m., but something in my gut told me to check. We turned the corner to find Dr. Patterson standing by a door, a heavy metal door I had never noticed before. His back was to us. He was mumbling to himself, as if he were talking to someone. "Dr. Patterson?" I called out. He didn't respond. I looked at Carla, and she looked back at me, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. Slowly, I approached him, and I could feel the air growing colder. "Dr. Patterson, what's going on?" I asked again. This time, he turned slowly to face me, his eyes dark, empty. He didn't smile. He didn't speak. Behind him, the door creaked open. I didn't wait for him to move. I grabbed Carla's arm and pulled her back toward the stairs, ignoring the scream that built up in my throat. We ran out of the basement, all the way to the front desk, and the first thing I did was call 911. When the police arrived, they searched the basement and found a small, hidden room. Inside, there were medical records, patients' belongings, and enough evidence to show that Dr. Patterson had been conducting some sort of illegal experiment. It didn't make sense. He was manipulating patients' files, drugging them, and somehow making them disappear. He had been using the cover of the night shift to do whatever he was doing down there. I never went back to work after that. The hospital was investigated, but I don't know if anything truly came of it. I didn't stick around to find out. I couldn't. I don't know what happened to Dr. Patterson. I never heard his name again, but every time I see the hospital on the news, I wonder if someone else will find out what he was doing. I don't think I'll ever understand what happened that night, but I know this: I'll never forget the cold emptiness in his eyes. It was a Saturday morning when my fiancée and I decided to go check out this house we found online. The listing looked great, spacious, affordable, and in a decent area. We had been looking for a while, and everything about this house seemed perfect. The listing photos were all bright, airy rooms, and the backyard was exactly what we wanted. I was excited, and my fiancée, Sarah, was too. We were getting serious about settling down, and this place could be the one. We arrived at the address a little early, parked, and waited in the car for a few minutes. It wasn't a very busy area. Just a quiet street with houses spaced out, a little too quiet for my taste, but it didn't bother me. We went up to the front door, and I rang the bell. I looked around while we waited for the realtor. The house itself was nice from the outside, big, with a porch, a 2-car garage, a couple of bushes near the front door, a few trees around the yard. The kind of house you could see yourself living in. The door opened after a few moments, but no one was there. I thought maybe the realtor had just been in the back, getting ready or something. I stepped forward and looked inside. The house was dark inside. There were no lights on, but the door was open just wide enough for me to see the hallway. I called out, "Hello?" No answer. I looked at Sarah, who was standing next to me. "Maybe we're early," she suggested. I shrugged. "Could be. I'll wait a couple minutes." We both stood there in the silence, waiting for someone to come to the door. But after another minute or so, I started to get the feeling something wasn't quite right. It wasn't like the place was abandoned. The door was unlocked, but the house still had furniture in it, like it was ready for showings. I was about to turn around and call the real estate agency when I heard a noise inside, faint footsteps, like someone moving in the other room. "Hello?" I called again, a little louder this time. Nothing. I pushed the door open slightly and peeked inside. The house was old, but clean, well maintained. There were a few pieces of furniture scattered around, a couch here, a coffee table there, but it looked like it had been staged for a showing. Nothing too personal or too lived in. Just the bare essentials to make it look homey. But still, it felt off. I stepped inside and looked around. The air smelled faintly of something sweet, like cinnamon, but it felt stale, almost like no one had been in the house for a while. I glanced over at Sarah, who was still standing by the door, looking hesitant. "We should go back to the car and call the agency," Sarah said, looking uneasy. Maybe they forgot about the appointment. Before I could respond, I heard it again, the soft sound of footsteps, coming from upstairs this time. "Did you hear that?" I asked, turning to Sarah. She nodded, wide-eyed. "I'm not going upstairs alone," she said, voice trembling. "Neither am I," I replied. But I wasn't sure what to do next. We could leave, but something about the situation had me frozen, like I couldn't quite put my finger on why it felt wrong, but it did. We both stood there, not moving, until I heard the footsteps again. This time they were louder, more deliberate. And then, they stopped. I swallowed hard. "I think we should check it out." "What?" Sarah said, staring at me like I had lost my mind. "I don't know," I said, my voice shaky. I feel like we should see what's going on." Sarah looked at me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "All right, but I'm not going first." We cautiously made our way toward the stairs. I didn't know what I was expecting, but I kept waiting for someone to step out, for a realtor to greet us, or for someone to explain the situation. When we reached the top of the stairs, we were hit by a strong smell, something metallic, almost like blood. I gagged at the scent, but tried to ignore it. At the top of the stairs, there were 2 doors. One was closed, but the other was slightly ajar. I pushed it open slowly, holding my breath. What I saw made my stomach drop. The room was set up like a normal bedroom, except it wasn't. There were strange marks on the floor, like something heavy had been dragged across it. A large rug was pulled to the side, revealing a section of the floor that had been scratched up. My heart was racing now, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I heard a noise from behind me and turned. Sarah was still standing in the hallway, but she looked pale. I took a step back toward her. "We need to leave now," I said. But as I turned to go, my foot caught on something. I looked down, and that's when I saw it, a small piece of rope. It was thin, but strong. The kind of rope you'd use to tie something up. I pulled on it, and the floorboard beneath me creaked, like something was being dragged under it. I felt like I was suffocating. "This is all wrong," I muttered. I backed away from the room and turned to Sarah. "We need to call the police. This place it's a trap." As I started toward the stairs, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The door to the master bedroom was open, and the closet door was hanging half off its hinges. Inside, I could see the faint outline of a bag, but it wasn't just any bag, it was a large, heavy-duty duffel bag. My heart pounded, and my instinct screamed at me to run. "We need to get out of here, now," I whispered to Sarah, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her toward the stairs. As we rushed toward the front door, I glanced back at the living room. The house was eerily silent. No sign of anyone, but the feeling that we weren't alone lingered. We got to the front door, but just as I reached for the handle, the door slammed shut. I turned to Sarah, panic setting in. "What the hell?" The sound of footsteps echoed from upstairs. Heavy, deliberate. Someone was coming. I didn't wait. I grabbed the handle again and yanked as hard as I could, throwing open the door. We ran out of the house and didn't look back. We didn't stop until we were in the car, and I drove as fast as I could, not saying a word. When we got to the nearest police station, we told them everything. They sent a team to check the house, but by the time they arrived, the place was completely empty. No sign of anyone. They told us there were no records of the house being on the market at all. The agency we contacted, they said they had no idea who the realtor was. It was as if everything about the house had been fabricated. I don't know who set that trap, or what they were planning to do, but I know one thing for sure, we were lucky to get out of there alive. It was supposed to be a simple hike. I had planned the route carefully, packed light, and set out early enough to make it back before dark. The weather forecast had called for scattered clouds and the occasional light drizzle, but nothing that would make the trail dangerous. I should have known better, though. It's always the unexpected things that get you. The rain started coming down around mid-afternoon. At first, it was just a few drops here and there, nothing to worry about. But then the sky opened up. It went from light showers to a downpour in minutes. The kind of rain that drenches you completely, making everything slippery and slick. I figured it was best to find some shelter until it passed, but the trail didn't have much in the way of cover. There were no large trees, and the few small ones couldn't offer enough protection. I kept walking, hoping it would let up, but it didn't. After about 30 minutes of slogging through the wet mud, I spotted something through the trees, a cabin. I didn't know how far I was from the nearest town, but I knew it was probably someone's hunting cabin. The place didn't look like it was being used, and there was no sign of life, but it was a shelter. That was enough for me. I figured I'd just take a quick break and wait for the rain to ease up. I approached the cabin cautiously. There was no one around, and the place looked like it had been abandoned for years, covered in moss, with the wood starting to rot in spots. Still, it would keep me dry. I walked up to the door and tried the handle. To my surprise, it turned. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside, hoping no one would show up to kick me out. The inside was small, one room with a small fireplace and a dusty table in the middle. It looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. I shrugged it off. It was just a storm, and I needed a dry spot to sit for a while. So, I closed the door behind me, took off my jacket, and shook off as much water as I could. I could hear the rain pounding against the roof, and the wind howling outside, but at least I was warm. About 15 minutes passed. I was beginning to think the storm was going to stick around for a while when I heard a noise outside. At first, it was just a faint sound, maybe the wind or a branch breaking in the trees. But then I heard footsteps. Heavy footsteps, like someone was walking up to the cabin. My heart jumped in my chest. I didn't think anyone else was out here. It was too remote. The trail was empty when I started, and I hadn't seen anyone for hours. I held my breath and listened, trying to figure out if I had heard what I thought I had. The footsteps were getting closer. I froze, unsure of what to do. I wasn't supposed to be here. The cabin didn't look like it was meant for anyone but the person who owned it, and I wasn't about to get caught trespassing. Then I heard the door handle rattle. My blood ran cold. I quickly ducked behind the table, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The door creaked open, and I heard someone step inside. My stomach twisted. It wasn't just anyone. The man who walked in was wearing a long coat, his boots heavy against the floorboards. He was soaked, like he'd been out in the rain longer than I had. The door closed behind him with a thud. I stayed still, hoping he wouldn't notice me. I didn't know who he was, but I had a bad feeling. I wasn't supposed to be here, and now I was trapped. The storm outside was worse than ever, and there was no way I was going to make it back to the trail without getting drenched. But that didn't matter right now. The man in the cabin was a problem. He didn't speak for a while. Just stood there, probably shaking off the rain. I tried to stay as quiet as possible, hoping he wouldn't notice me crouched behind the table. But then he spoke. "What the hell are you doing in my cabin?" I nearly jumped out of my skin. His voice was low, rough, almost as if he didn't expect anyone to be here. I could hear the anger in his tone. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice shaky. "I was just looking for shelter from the rain. I didn't mean to intrude." There was a long pause, and I could hear him breathing. Then he laughed, but it wasn't a friendly laugh. It was dark, almost mocking. "Shelter? This is my place, you idiot. You think you can just walk in here like you own the damn place?" His voice rose, and I could hear him stepping closer. I stood up, my hands raised. "I swear, I didn't know it was yours. I just needed to get out of the rain." He didn't respond. I could hear his heavy footsteps now, moving across the floor. I could feel his presence coming closer, like he was circling me. I had to make a decision, stay and talk my way out of this, or bolt and risk getting caught. Before I could do anything, he was right in front of me. I backed up a step, but he grabbed my arm, his grip tight and painful. "You don't just come into someone's home without permission. You understand that?" he growled. I tried to pull away, but his hand wouldn't budge. His fingers dug into my skin, and I was starting to panic. I had no idea what this guy was going to do. The thought of being trapped in a cabin with an angry man out in the middle of nowhere was terrifying. "I'll leave. Just let me go," I pleaded, my voice trembling. He stared at me for a long moment, his eyes cold and calculating. Then he seemed to relax a little. "Not so fast," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "You're not just walking out of here. Not until we've had a little chat." I was stuck. There was nowhere to go. The door was still behind him, but I didn't think I could get past him without a struggle. And there was no one around for miles. The storm was still raging outside, and the night was pitch black. If I ran, he could catch me easily. I had no choice. I needed to try and get out, somehow. But this guy wasn't going to make it easy. My mind raced for a way to calm him down, to get him to let go of my arm, but I couldn't think clearly. Every part of me screamed to just leave, but I had no idea how far the road was, how long it would take to find help. And then, just as I thought things couldn't get worse, the door creaked open again. Another figure stepped inside. This one was younger, and they looked just as drenched as the man. Their eyes met mine, and for a split second, I thought I saw a flash of sympathy. Then they quickly looked down at the floor, avoiding any eye contact. "Is everything okay?" the younger person asked, voice uncertain. The older man's grip on my arm loosened just a little, but he didn't answer right away. I used that moment to slip out of his grasp, backing away slowly. "I'm leaving. I don't want any trouble. I'm just looking for shelter. Please." To my relief, the older man didn't stop me this time. His eyes were still cold, but he didn't reach for me again. He just stood there, watching as I backed toward the door. I ran out into the rain without looking back, not waiting for any kind of answer, not caring if he called after me. I kept running until I found a road, then kept walking, not stopping until I finally reached a town. I didn't stop to talk to anyone about it. I didn't want to explain what happened in that cabin, but I'll never forget it. That feeling of being trapped in a place with someone who wanted nothing more than to hurt you, and the terror of knowing there was no one around to stop him. I still wonder what would have happened if that second person hadn't shown up when they did. It was supposed to be a fun weekend. A few friends and I had decided to go camping, just the 5 of us. We picked a spot deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town. The weather was supposed to be perfect, cool but not too cold, with clear skies and sunshine. But by the time we set up our tents, the clouds had started to gather, and by the evening, the rain had come. At first, it wasn't anything too serious. Just a light drizzle. We didn't think much of it. We made a fire, cooked some food, and talked well into the night. As the evening went on, the rain began to fall harder, but we all thought it was just a passing storm. By the time we finished eating and cleaned up, the rain had turned into something more serious. The sound of the rain hitting the tent grew louder, and the wind started picking up. It wasn't just a storm anymore. I remember lying in my tent, listening to the downpour, the rain drumming on the roof of the tent like 1,000 tiny hammers. I tried to sleep, but the noise and the way the wind howled around us made it impossible. Every so often, I could hear a tree creaking, and I wondered if one of them would fall. The storm was getting worse, but there wasn't much we could do about it. We were stuck out there. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up to something worse. It was the sound of water. At first, I thought I had imagined it, but the sound grew louder. The rain wasn't just falling anymore, it was rising. I could hear the rush of water outside, and it didn't take long for the panic to set in. We were in a low-lying area, and the ground around us was starting to flood. I unzipped my tent and stepped outside. The rain hit me like a slap to the face. The ground was already turning into mud, and I could hear the rushing of water all around us. The stream we had crossed earlier in the day was now a fast-moving river. It had swollen up so quickly, and it was moving so violently that I knew we couldn't wait much longer. We needed to get out. I woke the others up. They were groggy and confused, but when they saw what was happening, panic set in fast. We all scrambled to gather our things, flashlights, the car keys, anything we could grab, but the rain was relentless. The floodwaters were rising quickly, and there was no way we could stay there much longer. As we made our way to higher ground, the rain got heavier. It felt like the world around us was closing in. We moved as quickly as we could, but the ground was getting slick, and the water was rising faster than we expected. At one point, I slipped and almost got swept away. My feet were moving, but the ground was so slippery it was impossible to keep my footing. "We need to go," Sarah yelled, her voice barely audible over the storm. She was panicking, her eyes wide as she scanned the water, looking for a way out. "I'm trying," I shouted back. "We just need to find somewhere safe." It was so dark, and the rain was coming down so hard that I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead of me. The others were close behind, but I could hear the rushing water all around us, and the wind howling like it wanted to tear everything apart. We reached a small rise in the ground, and we all paused, catching our breath. We were standing in what used to be a clearing, but now the water was ankle deep, swirling around our feet. We were no longer just running from the rain, we were fighting the storm and the flood. "Where's Ben?" Sarah asked suddenly, looking around. He was right behind me. I turned and looked. Ben wasn't there. I could see him just moments ago, moving quickly toward the rise, but now, nothing. I called his name, my voice drowned out by the rain and wind. "Ben. Ben." No answer. My heart began to pound. "Ben." I called again, more urgently this time. But nothing. No response. I turned to the others, panic creeping into my chest. He was right behind me. "Where is he?" "We need to keep moving," Danny said, his face pale in the dim light. "We can't stay here." "But we can't leave him," I said, my voice shaking. I couldn't believe he had disappeared. He couldn't have just vanished. He was with us seconds ago. "We need to go," Sarah repeated. "We don't have time." I didn't want to listen. I didn't want to believe that Ben was gone. But the water was rising. It was getting harder to stand. The trees around us were bending in the wind, and I could feel the earth shifting under my feet. We were running out of time. "I'll go back for him," I said, but Danny grabbed my arm, stopping me. "No, you'll get yourself killed. We need to go." It felt like everything was slipping out of control. I didn't know what to do. The storm, the flood, everything was happening so fast. We had to make a choice, stay and look for Ben, or keep moving and hope we could find safety before it was too late. We made the decision to leave. We moved as quickly as we could, but the floodwaters were rising even faster now. The mud sucked at our boots, and the ground beneath us felt like it was sliding away. We had to scramble to keep moving. Every so often, I looked back, hoping to see Ben running toward us, but he never appeared. It was hours before we finally made it to the main road. By then, the floodwaters had started to recede, but the storm was still raging. We stumbled out onto the road, exhausted, cold, and soaked to the bone. The sound of the rain pounding the earth was deafening, but at least we were out of the woods. We never found Ben. We waited for hours, hoping he would show up, but he never did. We called his phone. No answer. We called the police, but by the time they arrived, the water had already begun to subside. They searched, but nothing. It's been months now. I still don't know what happened to him. The last time I saw him, he was just a few feet away, but when we turned back to look for him, he was gone. There's no explanation. Nothing made sense. We thought we were all going to make it out together, but Ben didn't. I still don't know if it was the flood that took him or something else. I keep hearing his voice in my head, calling out to me, but every time I turn around, there's nothing there. I don't know if I'll ever be able to shake the image of him disappearing into the storm. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that night. We had been looking forward to this trip for months. It was supposed to be the perfect getaway, just the four of us, out in the wilderness for a weekend of hiking, fishing, and a bit of relaxation. It was a fairly remote site, a campsite that had been reserved in advance. The kind of place where you wouldn't run into too many people, just the peace and quiet of the forest. We arrived a little later than planned, just as the sun was dipping behind the treetops, casting long shadows across the ground. We were all tired, but excited, ready to set up camp. When we pulled into the area, we noticed something right away. It wasn't what we expected. The spot where our camp should have been was empty, but there was something else there, a mess. The tents, all of them, were torn and half collapsed. Some were shredded, others just left in a pile, and there was a faint smell in the air, kind of sour and rotting. We all got out of the truck, staring at the mess. At first, I thought it might have been an animal. Maybe a bear or something had gotten into the camp and destroyed everything. But there was something off about it. It didn't feel right. Maybe it's just an old camp, Mark suggested. He's always the one trying to make light of things. Maybe they didn't clean up or something. But as we looked around, it was clear this wasn't just some careless camp. The food that was left out was rotten cans of beans and tuna, half-open bags of chips, and boxes of crackers. All of it was covered in mold. The smell was unbearable. We walked further into the camp, and that's when I noticed the markings on the trees. They weren't just scratches or random carvings. They were deliberate, almost like symbols, but I couldn't make sense of them. They looked old, but also fresh, like someone had marked them recently. "What the hell is this?" Sarah whispered, pointing at one of the trees. The symbol was crudely scratched into the bark, something jagged and unnatural. We all stood there for a second, unsure of what to make of it. There was no sign of any people around. Just the empty, destroyed camp and the strange markings. I felt uneasy, like we weren't supposed to be there. Mark was still trying to make it seem less alarming, like it was just a coincidence. He suggested we go ahead and set up our camp anyway, even though this wasn't our designated spot. The site wasn't far from where we had planned to camp, so we figured it wouldn't hurt to just stay there for the night. We started unpacking, and that's when we realized something else. There were things missing, small things at first. My lighter, Sarah's small first aid kit, and some of our water bottles. At first, I thought we were just misplacing them, but then I realized someone else must have been here recently. Maybe we weren't the only ones who found this site. I mentioned it to the group, but everyone else shrugged it off. I felt uncomfortable, but I didn't want to be the one to ruin the trip. The sun had almost set, so we started the campfire and decided to have dinner. That's when the sound started. At first, it was nothing, just the usual rustling of the trees and the crackling of the fire. But then, we heard something else. It was quiet at first, footsteps, soft and slow, like someone walking around our camp. It wasn't a random noise, it was deliberate, like someone was moving around the perimeter. We all stopped talking, listening. The footsteps came closer. My heart was pounding in my chest. I couldn't explain why, but I felt like we were being watched. I told everyone to stay quiet. I grabbed a flashlight from my bag, and we all huddled together, staring out into the dark. I was about to say something, but then I heard a twig snap, and that's when I saw it. In the distance, near the edge of the camp, a shadow moved between the trees. It was just for a second, but it was enough. Someone was out there. Someone who shouldn't be. I don't know why, but I felt sick, like something wasn't right. Sarah was the first to stand up, telling everyone to stay calm. She was usually the calm one in the group. She suggested we head to the truck, just to be safe. But when we went to grab our things, that's when we found it. The truck, the one we parked just a few hours earlier, was gone. It didn't make any sense. We hadn't driven anywhere. None of us had. But the truck was gone. The spot where we parked it was empty, the dirt and gravel untouched. It was like it had never been there. I don't know what kind of game this was, but I was starting to panic. We were in the middle of nowhere, with no way out. We decided to take a look around the camp again, maybe try to figure out if there was anything we missed. That's when I found the note. It was stuck to the underside of one of the broken tents. A small piece of paper, yellowed with age, with strange handwriting on it. It wasn't in any language I recognized, and it made my skin crawl just looking at it. I couldn't make out most of it, but at the bottom of the page, there was a date almost a year ago, to the day. The same time of year. And then, below it, one last line, they never left. I showed the others, and Sarah looked as pale as I felt. Mark was quiet for once. We all stood there, staring at the note. That's when we realized the truth. The people who had been here before, they were gone. They had vanished. No sign of them anywhere. And whatever had happened to them, it wasn't something we wanted to find out. We packed up our things and started walking in the opposite direction, away from the camp. The symbols on the trees, the weird note, the truck gone, it all started to make sense in a way that terrified me. Whoever had been here before us, whoever had left that note, they weren't normal. And I wasn't about to stick around to find out what had happened to them. As we walked away from the camp, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing just out of sight. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest road, and even then, I couldn't stop looking back into the trees, waiting for something or someone to come after us. We never went back to that place. We don't talk about it anymore, but sometimes, when we're all together, we'll mention it in passing. We don't speak of it too much. I don't think any of us ever really got over what happened that weekend. But one thing I know for sure is that there's something in those woods. Something we'll never understand. It's hard to know where to begin with this. I think it's taken me so long to write this because it still feels like a bad dream. Even now, when I think about it, I can't shake the feeling that something went horribly wrong that day, something that could have been avoided if we just made different choices. We were all experienced hikers, at least a little, and we planned this trip for months. The idea was to camp in the mountains for a weekend, just to disconnect from everything. It was supposed to be simple. We'd done this kind of thing before, just not in this particular area. The weather had been fine the whole trip, and the first couple of days went off without a hitch. We had our laughs, we cooked our meals over a fire, and everything felt normal, almost too normal. By the third day, we were packing up to head back. It was late afternoon, and we had been moving slowly through the trails, not wanting to rush. But when we reached a certain point, one of the guys, Mark, suggested taking a shortcut. He'd been to this area a few times before, and apparently, this canyon was a faster way back to our camp. We all thought it was a good idea. We had a little time to spare, and the weather was holding up. It seemed like a quick detour that would save us some hours. None of us thought twice when Mark led the way. The canyon was narrow, with sheer rock walls on either side, but it didn't look dangerous. In fact, it looked beautiful in a way, like something out of a postcard. We walked through, chatting and laughing, taking in the view, oblivious to how quickly the time was slipping away. It wasn't until we'd gotten about halfway through that we noticed something wasn't right. At first, it was just a small sound, like gravel shifting behind us. Then it happened again. And again. It was almost like something was moving behind us, but when we turned around, there was nothing there. I remember feeling uneasy but brushing it off as nothing. Maybe just the rocks shifting, or the wind, who knows? But as we kept walking, the sound grew louder. It was like it was getting closer, and I could tell by the looks on everyone else's faces that they were starting to feel it too. But Mark, he didn't seem concerned. He kept saying it was nothing and urged us to keep going. We trusted him. That was our first mistake. I'm not sure what exactly happened after that. Maybe the sound was the beginning of it, or maybe it was just bad luck. But all of a sudden, the ground beneath us started to shake. It wasn't just a small tremor. The rocks above us began to shift, and before any of us could react, the entire side of the canyon gave way. I remember the sound first, the screech of stone scraping against stone, the crashing and rumbling as the rocks began to tumble down. And then the dust. It was like the world went gray all at once. I couldn't breathe, couldn't see, and I remember feeling the ground jerk beneath me. The next thing I knew, I was on the ground, trying to cover my face from the dirt and rocks. I could hear the others yelling, but everything was muffled. The chaos was overwhelming, like the world was collapsing in on itself. When the dust finally started to settle, I opened my eyes. The canyon walls had changed. What had once been a clear path was now a mess of rocks and debris, completely blocking our way. Mark was the closest to me, his face covered in dirt, but he was alive. I could see he was trying to stand, his legs shaky. We all helped each other up, but the reality of the situation hit hard. We were trapped. The narrow canyon we'd been walking through was now impassable, and there was no way to climb out. I remember looking up and realizing that the canyon walls were too steep, too smooth to climb. And no matter how many times we shouted, no one came. We were completely alone. There were no other hikers, no signs of life, just the sound of the wind and our panic breathing. I looked around at the others. We had a few supplies of water, some food, our basic camping gear, but nothing that could help us get out of there. The worst part was the silence. It felt like we were miles from help, and in that moment, it hit me that no one knew where we were. We hadn't checked in with anyone, and I wasn't sure anyone even knew which way we'd gone. We hadn't planned for something like this. The first few hours were spent trying to move the rocks, trying to dig our way out, but it was useless. Every time we thought we'd found a way through, more rocks would shift, making it harder to get through. We had enough water to last us a while, but that didn't make the fear go away. It was becoming clear that our time was running out. We couldn't stay here. We needed to get out. By nightfall, things got worse. It was already getting cold, and the air was thick with dust. We huddled together for warmth, but I could tell we were all exhausted. Mark was the one trying to keep everyone calm, but even he seemed rattled. No one said it out loud, but we all knew it, we were stuck. No one was coming to help, and the rocks above us could still fall. We rationed the food and water, but with the days dragging on, it didn't seem like it would be enough. The next morning, we made a decision. There wasn't much we could do at that point, but we had to try something. We needed to get to higher ground to see if we could find a way out. But even that felt like a stretch. As we moved toward the top of the canyon, trying to find a way through the rocks, one of the guys, Sam, tripped and twisted his ankle. It wasn't just a sprain. The way he screamed when he fell, I knew it was bad. We had to stop and tend to him, and that delayed us even further. But in the back of my mind, I knew that we were running out of time. The reality was starting to sink in. After a few days, when it seemed like we might not make it out, something changed. We had all been silently wondering if it was possible that we weren't alone in this canyon. The silence around us was so complete that it felt unnatural. And then, one afternoon, Mark disappeared. I don't know how he did it. I don't know if he was trying to find help, or if he'd just gone crazy, but he was gone. He'd left without a word. We searched for hours, but there was no sign of him. It felt like he just vanished. That's when I knew we weren't going to make it out without help. It was too dangerous to keep going alone. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, I managed to climb up to the top of the canyon, to a small ledge where I could get a better view. From there, I could see the main trail that we had taken days earlier. I could see the small stream where we had camped, just a few miles away. I knew we had to make it. It wasn't much, but it was the only chance we had left. We made it back to camp just in time. It was a hard climb down, and Sam was still hurt, but we made it. I don't know how we survived that canyon, but we did. We were lucky, I guess. I still don't know what happened to Mark. It started out as a dumb idea. My friends dared me to hide out in the department store after closing. They said I wouldn't last an hour alone after the lights went off. We'd been hanging out at the mall all afternoon, and by the time we came up with the plan, it was almost closing time. They left before the staff started their final rounds, leaving me alone to figure out how to stay unnoticed. I found a spot behind a rack of winter coats in the men's section. It wasn't perfect, but it was quiet, and the coats hung low enough to block me from sight. I crouched there, waiting, listening as the last announcements played overhead and the store got quieter. Eventually, I heard the sound of the security gates rolling down at the entrances. When everything was silent, I crawled out. The store looked strange in the dark, all shadows and empty aisles. It wasn't scary, not yet. Mostly, it felt like I'd stepped into another world. I walked through the aisles, trying not to make too much noise. My plan was to stay for a couple of hours, take a few pictures to prove I'd done it, and then sneak out when the gates reopened in the morning. I headed to the electronics section first. The TV displays were off, but a few laptops were still on, their screens casting faint blue light. I took out my phone to record a video, whispering into the mic about how I was all alone. That's when I heard the first noise, a sharp, metallic clink, like a door handle being turned. I froze, holding my breath, and looked around. Nothing moved. The sound didn't come again, so I told myself it was just part of the store settling. I kept walking, heading toward the toy section. That's when I saw the flashlight. It was faint at first, a beam of light sweeping across the floor on the far side of the store. My stomach dropped. I hadn't thought about security. I figured they'd just lock the doors and leave, maybe check the cameras once in a while. But someone was definitely inside, moving through the aisles. I ducked behind a shelf and tried to think. If they caught me, I'd be in trouble. Maybe not arrested, but definitely banned from the mall, and my parents would kill me. I decided to wait until the light passed and then find a better hiding spot until the person left. But the light didn't pass. It got closer. I could hear footsteps now, slow and deliberate, like whoever it was wasn't in any hurry. I crouched lower, pressing myself against the back of the shelf. The footsteps stopped, and I held my breath, listening. Then I heard a voice. "I know you're in here." It wasn't loud, but it carried through the silence of the store. The tone was flat, almost casual, but there was something off about it, something that made my skin crawl. "I saw you on the cameras," the voice continued. "Come out now, and this will be easy." I didn't move. My heart was pounding so hard I was afraid he'd hear it. I peeked through a gap in the shelves and saw the flashlight beam swinging back and forth. The man holding it was wearing a uniform, but it didn't look like the mall security I'd seen before. His shirt was too loose, untucked, and there was no badge. Just a dark shape stitched over the pocket. He walked past my aisle, the light sweeping dangerously close to where I was hiding. I stayed frozen, trying to keep my breathing as quiet as possible. After a few seconds, he moved on, but I didn't feel safe. Something about him wasn't right. When I couldn't hear his footsteps anymore, I crept out and headed toward the back of the store, where the employee-only area was. My new plan was to hide in the stockroom until morning. The store's cameras couldn't see back there, and I figured the man wouldn't bother checking. The stockroom was cold and smelled like cardboard. Rows of shelves stretched out in every direction, filled with boxes and loose items. I found a spot behind a stack of pallets and sat down, trying to calm myself. My phone buzzed in my pocket, and I pulled it out. There was a message from one of my friends. "Did you chicken out yet?" I started typing a reply when I heard the sound of a door opening nearby. The stockroom door. I shoved my phone into my pocket and scrambled deeper into the pallets, crouching low. The man's footsteps were heavier now, echoing in the quiet space. His flashlight beam cut through the gaps between the shelves, searching. He didn't say anything this time, just walked slowly, methodically. I realized then that he wasn't looking for a thief or someone breaking the rules. He was hunting. I held my breath as the light passed over the pallets where I was hiding. It lingered for a second, then moved on. The footsteps grew fainter, and I thought he might be leaving, but then they stopped. "Do you think I won't find you?" he said. His voice was closer than I expected. "This is my place. My rules." I felt a wave of panic. I couldn't stay there. If he found me, I didn't think he'd just kick me out. There was something wrong with him, something dangerous. I waited until his light moved away, then crawled out from my hiding spot and headed toward the exit. I made it back to the sales floor without being seen. The store was even darker now, and I could barely see a few feet ahead of me. I moved as quickly as I could, trying to stay quiet. The front doors were just ahead, and I could see the faint glow of the mall's lights beyond the gates. I thought I was going to make it. Then I heard the sound of keys jingling behind me. I turned and saw the man standing at the edge of the aisle. He wasn't shining his flashlight anymore, but I could see him clearly enough. His face was pale, his eyes wide and unblinking. He smiled, and it wasn't a friendly smile. "Leaving already?" he asked. I didn't answer. I turned and ran toward the front doors, my sneakers squeaking on the tile. I heard him running behind me, his footsteps faster now, closing the distance. When I reached the gate, I grabbed the bars and shook them, but they didn't budge. The locks were solid, and there was no way I could squeeze through. I looked around, desperate for another way out, and saw the fire exit sign glowing in the distance. I sprinted for it, my legs burning, my lungs aching. The man was still behind me, but I didn't look back. When I reached the fire exit, I slammed into the bar and pushed it open. The alarm blared, deafening, but I didn't care. I ran outside into the cold night air, my chest heaving. I didn't stop running until I was halfway across the parking lot. When I finally turned around, the man was standing in the doorway, just watching me. He didn't chase me. He just stood there, the alarm blaring behind him, until I was out of sight. I never told anyone what happened. Not my friends, not my parents. I don't even know if they would have believed me. It's hard for me to even think about what happened. I still get flashes of that weekend, the way everything spiraled out of control so quickly. The woods were supposed to be a getaway, a way to unwind from the daily grind. I thought we were going to have a good time, just the 5 of us. But none of us expected the nightmare that followed. It started on the 2nd day of our camping trip. We had set up camp in a secluded area, deep in the forest, a place that wasn't too far from the nearest trail, but far enough that we felt like we had some privacy. The kind of spot where you can hear only the wind and the occasional rustle of wildlife. No cell service, no distractions. We were there to get away, to relax. There was me, my friend Matt, his girlfriend Claire, and 2 others, Jake and Maria. Everyone was in a good mood that morning. We had spent the previous day hiking around, exploring, and just enjoying the peace of being out in nature. We even made a small fire, roasted some marshmallows, and had a few beers. It was nice. But things took a turn when we decided to venture into the woods to gather some wild mushrooms. Matt had done it before, and we all figured it would be a good way to add something fresh to our dinner. Claire wasn't too sure about it, but she went along with it, not wanting to be the odd one out. We wandered for maybe half an hour before Matt found some mushrooms he said were safe. He seemed pretty confident, even a little too confident. We weren't experts, but he swore by it. So we picked a decent amount, enough to cook with. By the time we returned to camp, the sun was beginning to set, and we were all hungry. We cooked up what we gathered with the rest of the food we brought. It wasn't long after we ate that things started to go south. At first, it was subtle. Claire mentioned feeling a little off, but she chalked it up to the hike. Jake seemed a little more tired than usual, but we figured it was from the heat. Matt was fine, or so he claimed. But then, about an hour later, Maria suddenly doubled over, clutching her stomach. Her face went pale, and her breathing started to come in sharp gasps. We all rushed her, asking if she was okay, but she could barely answer. She was sweating, her body stiff and trembling. I couldn't tell what was going on. She wasn't drunk. She wasn't allergic to anything, at least as far as we knew. But she kept muttering that she felt wrong. That something was wrong inside her. At first, we thought it might have been a stomach bug, or maybe she ate something that didn't sit right with her. But as time went on, her condition worsened. She wasn't just nauseous, she was shaking uncontrollably. Her skin started to flush red, and her eyes became unfocused. By then, Claire was panicking, trying to get a signal on her phone to call for help, but there was nothing. No bars. We were stuck. We tried to make her comfortable, but nothing helped. We gave her water, hoping it would settle her stomach, but it just made things worse. She started vomiting, and then she collapsed. That was when we realized just how serious it was. It felt like the air around us had thickened, the reality of the situation sinking in. She wasn't getting better. She was getting worse. I remember trying to calm Claire down, telling her everything would be fine, but I didn't know what to do either. We were in the middle of nowhere, miles away from the nearest town. No phone signal, no way to get help. It was like a nightmare that had become real. We knew we had to do something. The only thing we could think of was to get help, but we had no idea who to trust. Matt insisted it was the mushrooms. He started muttering about how some of them could be poisonous if you weren't careful. He had eaten them, too, but he didn't seem as bad. Still, his face was pale, and he looked nauseous. Claire wanted to leave and try to find help, but we didn't know the way. And we couldn't just leave Maria like this. We were stuck. We had a long conversation, trying to figure out who could leave and who should stay behind with Maria. But every time we talked about it, the situation seemed more and more dire. No one wanted to leave her. No one wanted to risk it. But we also couldn't just stay there and do nothing. We were all scared. Everyone was scared. Matt eventually volunteered. He said he could handle it, that he was the only one who knew the way back to the trail. The rest of us were in no condition to hike out, Maria was in no shape to move, and Jake and Claire were both starting to show signs of nausea too. I wasn't feeling great myself, but I was functional. Barely. I remember Matt leaving with a small pack of supplies. He said he would be back as quickly as he could, but none of us believed him. We all knew the forest was vast, and the nearest town was over 20 miles away. Even if he made it to the trail, it would take hours for him to get help, and that was if he didn't get lost or collapse along the way. Hours passed. We sat by the fire, the sounds of the woods creeping in around us, the stillness broken only by Maria's labored breathing. The night seemed to stretch on forever. Every time the wind rustled the trees, we thought it might be Matt coming back. But it wasn't. It never was. By the time morning came, we were all on edge. Maria was still out of it, barely conscious. The rest of us were exhausted, too sick to move properly. I checked her pulse and tried to keep her warm, but she was slipping. It was like she wasn't even there anymore, her body limp and unresponsive. I don't know how long we would have lasted if Matt hadn't come back. When he did, he was almost unrecognizable. His face was drawn, his eyes wild, and his movements were shaky. He said he'd found a cabin on the edge of the forest and managed to get to a phone. Help was on the way. But even then, I could tell something was off. He looked pale, his hands trembling. The rescue team arrived a few hours later. They took Maria and the rest of us back to the town. By then, we were all feeling better, though none of us were sure if we could trust what had happened. Maria had to stay in the hospital for a few days to recover, but she made it. We never did figure out exactly what happened, what had caused the poisoning, or if it was the mushrooms at all. We never went back to that place. I still don't know what Matt saw or did out there, but I don't want to know. Whatever happened, it was close. Too close. I went camping alone up in the mountains last spring, just to get away from everything for a few days. It's something I like to do from time to time, the quiet, the solitude, the chance to just clear my mind. I'm not someone who gets nervous easily, especially not in nature. I've been on countless hikes and camping trips. So, when I set up camp at a little clearing just off the main trail, I thought it would be another peaceful night. The weather was perfect, and I was feeling good. I had a small fire going, just enough to cook my dinner and keep the bugs away. It was about dusk, and I was sitting on a log by the fire, eating some canned chili. That's when I heard footsteps. At first, I figured it was a deer or some other animal, but the sound was too steady, too deliberate. I tensed up, standing up slowly and turning toward the noise. Out of the trees stepped a man, maybe in his mid-30s. He looked scruffy, hair long and unkempt, clothes worn and dusty, like he'd been walking for a long time. He didn't look dangerous at first, but something about the way he approached made my stomach tighten. He smiled, and I could tell it wasn't the kind of smile that made you feel at ease. "Hey there," he said, his voice rough, like he hadn't spoken to anyone in days. "You got a minute?" I was hesitant but didn't want to be rude. "Sure. What's up?" "I'm just lost," he said, walking closer to my fire. "Been walking for hours, trying to find the trail again. You wouldn't happen to have a map, would you?" I glanced at the small map I had tucked in my bag and then back at him. Something felt off. His clothes were too worn for someone just out for a hike, and there was a smell to him, damp, musty, and a little like sweat. But I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I offered him a quick smile. "Yeah, I've got one, but I'm not sure you're too far off the trail. You should be able to find it if you head north." He nodded like he was listening, but then just stood there. And for a moment, he didn't say anything. His eyes just stayed on me, almost studying me, like he was trying to figure something out. I didn't like the way he was looking at me. It felt like he wasn't interested in finding the trail anymore, like he was waiting for me to invite him to stay. "You camping out here?" he asked, his voice much softer now, like we were having a casual conversation. I wasn't sure how to answer. The tone of his voice had shifted. He wasn't just lost anymore. He was interested in something else. "Yeah, just for a few nights." He nodded again, taking a few steps closer to the fire. Too close. I took a step back without thinking, suddenly feeling the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't want to be rude, but I wasn't about to let some random guy get too close to me in the middle of nowhere. "You alone?" he asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Seems kind of dangerous out here all by yourself, don't it?" I forced a smile, trying to keep the conversation light. "It's not too bad. I'm used to it." He didn't seem convinced. "You ever worry someone might show up, though?" "Someone like me?" That hit me like a cold wave, and I froze. His words hung in the air, almost like a threat disguised as a joke. I didn't know if I should laugh it off or if I should take it seriously. I decided not to engage, hoping he'd get the hint. "Look, I should probably get some sleep," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's getting late." But he didn't move. Instead, he leaned against a tree, just standing there, staring at me with that same unsettling gaze. "You got a tent set up, or are you just sleeping under the stars?" he asked, his voice calm, but there was something in it, something almost too calm, like he was probing for more. I didn't answer right away. I was trying to keep my thoughts together, but the unease I felt was growing. I glanced at my tent, then back at him. His posture had changed. He was no longer just standing still. He was leaning in slightly, almost like he was waiting for me to say something, anything. "I'm good for the night," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'm just gonna get some rest. You should probably head out before it gets too dark." But he didn't leave. He just kept standing there. I could hear him shifting, like he was trying to make himself comfortable without really moving away. I tried to stay calm, but everything inside me was screaming to just get in the tent and zip myself up. The man took a step closer. "You ever think about what would happen if someone didn't leave?" That was it. That was the moment I realized I was dealing with someone who wasn't just lost. He wasn't just a drifter passing through. He was trying to make me feel small, make me uncomfortable, make me unsure. And in that moment, I knew I had to act. "I think you should go," I said, my voice low but firm. "Now." His smile didn't fade, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something that made the blood in my veins freeze. For a second, he just stood there, looking at me like he was trying to decide whether to push it further. Then, without saying another word, he turned and started walking away, his footsteps slow and deliberate, almost like he was savoring the moment. As he moved further into the trees, I couldn't help but watch him, my heart pounding in my chest. The silence that followed was deafening, and I was still holding my breath, waiting for him to turn around, to come back, too. But he didn't. I didn't sleep that night. I spent the hours lying in my tent, listening to the noises around me. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind in the trees, made my heart race. I was afraid to fall asleep, afraid that he'd come back, or worse, that he'd already be waiting for me outside. At dawn, I packed up my things and left. I didn't care about the hike I had planned. I just wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. I didn't look back. I couldn't. As I drove away, I kept thinking about the way he'd looked at me, about his words. I couldn't shake the feeling that he had known exactly what he was doing. And if I hadn't stood my ground, I don't know what might have happened. I haven't been camping since. I don't know if I ever will again. I can't get the image of him standing there, just watching me, out of my head. I don't think I'll ever feel safe out there again. The rain had started before I left the office, but I didn't think much of it. By the time I was halfway home, it was coming down in sheets, so heavy my wipers couldn't keep up. It was one of those back roads, winding and narrow, with no lights except for my own headlights cutting through the dark. I was going slower than usual, but the pavement was slick and the turns were sharp. I don't even remember what I hit. It could have been a branch or a patch of water pooling on the curve. My tires slid, and before I knew it, I was skidding off the road. The car slammed into something, maybe a tree, and came to a stop. My chest hurt from the seatbelt digging in, but I wasn't bleeding. I tried the engine, but it just sputtered. Dead. I grabbed my phone, but the signal was gone. It was too far out, too isolated. The rain was coming down so hard that staying in the car felt useless. I had seen a house just a little way back. I figured I could at least ask to use their phone. Leaving my car felt wrong, but what else could I do? I put up my hood and stepped out, the rain soaking through my shoes almost immediately. The house wasn't far, maybe a quarter mile at most. It was big, an old farmhouse kind of place, sitting back from the road with a long gravel driveway. The lights were on inside, which made me think someone would help. I jogged up to the porch, trying to shake off the water before I knocked on the door. I waited, shivering. The rain made everything sound muffled, like the world had shrunk to just me in this house. No one answered. I knocked again, harder this time. A light flicked on upstairs, and I saw a shadow move behind the curtains. Someone was home. I knocked again and called out, "I'm sorry to bother you. My car broke down. I just need help." After a few seconds, I heard the lock turn, and the door opened just a crack. A man stood there, older, maybe in his late 60s, with thin hair and a lined face. He was holding the door with one hand, and the other was hidden behind it. His eyes were sharp, watching me closely. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice low. "My car's stuck down the road," I said. "It won't start, and I don't have a signal. I just need to use your phone, if that's okay." He didn't say anything for a moment, just looked me up and down. Then he nodded and opened the door wider. "Come in." The inside of the house smelled old, like wood and dust. The hallway was narrow, with faded wallpaper and a single bulb overhead casting long shadows. The man didn't speak as he shut the door behind me, and I noticed he slid the bolt across once it was closed. It felt strange, but I told myself it was just an old habit. "The phone's in the kitchen," he said, motioning down the hall. "You can use it." "Thank you," I said, trying to sound grateful. I followed him down the hall, my wet shoes squeaking on the floor. The kitchen was small, with a table in the corner and an old rotary phone mounted on the wall. I picked it up and listened for a dial tone, but there was nothing. "It's dead," I said, turning back to him. He nodded slowly, as if he already knew. "Storm must have knocked it out," he said. "Happens a lot out here." I didn't know what to say. I was stuck now, completely at his mercy. "Do you have a cell phone?" I asked, hoping he might have something newer. "Don't use them," he said flatly. "But you're welcome to wait here until the rain lets up. Maybe the phone will come back." I didn't have much choice, so I nodded. "Thank you," I said again. He motioned to the table. "Sit. I'll get you something warm." I sat down, the chair creaking under me. He moved to the stove, where a kettle was already sitting. I tried not to stare, but something about the way he moved felt off, like he was too deliberate, too careful. His hand shook a little as he poured the water, but his face stayed calm, almost blank. When he set the mug in front of me, I noticed his hand lingered on the edge of the table, just for a second. I looked down and saw faint scratches in the wood, like someone had dragged a knife across it over and over. My stomach tightened. "You live here alone?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He nodded. "Been here all my life. Don't get many visitors." I sipped the tea, even though I wasn't thirsty. It was bitter, and I wondered if he added something to it. The thought made me feel stupid, paranoid, but I couldn't shake it. He was just standing there, watching me, not drinking anything himself. "I should probably get back to my car," I said, setting the mug down. "Maybe someone else will come by." His face hardened. "You'll stay," he said. "It's too dangerous out there." I froze. The way he said it wasn't a suggestion. It was an order. "I'll be fine," I said, standing up. "Really, thank you for your help, but I don't want to bother you anymore." He stepped in front of me, blocking the door. "You can't leave," he said, his voice colder now. "Not yet." I glanced past him, toward the hallway. My heart was pounding. "Why not?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a knife. It wasn't big, but it was sharp, and he held it like he knew how to use it. "Sit down," he said. I backed up, my mind racing. The window over the sink was small, but I thought I could fit through it if I had to. The rain was still pounding outside, and the glass was fogged up, but it was better than staying. "I don't want trouble," I said. "I just want to leave." He shook his head slowly. "You shouldn't have come here." Before he could move, I grabbed the mug from the table and threw the hot tea at him. He screamed, clutching his face, and I bolted for the window. The latch was stiff, but I forced it open and scrambled through, landing hard in the mud outside. I ran, not looking back, slipping and stumbling in the rain. I could hear him shouting, but his voice faded as I put more distance between us. When I reached the road, I didn't stop. I kept going until I saw headlights in the distance. I waved my arms, desperate, and the car slowed. A woman rolled down her window, looking concerned. "Are you okay?" she asked. "Please," I said, breathless. I need help. There's a man back there, he has a knife. She unlocked the door, and I climbed in, shaking and soaked. She called the police as we drove away. I told them everything, but when they went to the house, it was empty. No sign of a man, no sign of anyone. I don't know where he went, but I still think about that night. About what could have happened if I hadn't gotten out. It was one of those nights where the rain just wouldn't let up. I had been driving for hours, alone on a long stretch of road that had practically no streetlights. The kind of road where your headlights are the only thing guiding you. The rain was coming down in sheets, and I had to keep the wipers on full speed to even have a chance of seeing through the windshield. It was already late, and I was exhausted, just trying to get home. I don't know exactly what made me look up, but something caught my eye, a flash of something dark ahead. My heart dropped when I realized it was a truck, flipped over, blocking the road. I wasn't expecting to see that in the middle of nowhere. The truck had clearly been in a bad accident, and from what I could make out, it was badly damaged. I could barely see the outline of the vehicle through the rain, but the shape was unmistakable. I slowed down, pulling my car off to the side of the road. There was no other traffic, no sign of any other drivers. The road was empty, and the storm had swallowed up the world around me. My first instinct was to stop, check for survivors. If there was anyone left alive in that wreck, they'd need help. I grabbed my phone, ready to call 911, but I didn't have much of a signal. It was too spotty in that area. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to calm down. It was a wreck. I needed help, but I wasn't going to be able to do much alone. I got out of my car, feeling the cold rain soak through my jacket. The air smelled like wet asphalt and something else, something sour. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it made my stomach turn. As I got closer to the truck, I saw that it had completely overturned, lying on its side in the mud. The driver's side was the most damaged, crushed up against the ground, while the passenger side was barely visible. The rear of the truck was still intact, though. I couldn't see anyone inside. The truck's engine was still running, the headlights flickering weakly. It was eerily quiet, the only sound the rain and the distant rumble of thunder. I made my way around to the driver's side. I called out, but no one answered. My heart was beating a little faster now, but I pushed it aside. There had to be someone, right? Someone in need of help. I reached the driver's side and tried the door, but it was jammed shut. I couldn't open it, and the windows were too dark to see through. I tried the other side of the truck, thinking maybe I could get in that way. That's when I noticed something strange, a strange, pungent smell coming from the back of the truck, mixed with the wet earth and rain. It wasn't until I rounded the back of the truck that I saw it clearly, rows of cages stacked inside. I froze. There were people in those cages. At first, I thought they were just unconscious, or maybe in shock from the crash. But as I stepped closer, I realized with sickening clarity that they were alive. Their eyes were wide, some of them were shaking, and they were all locked in place. I couldn't tell if they were bound with ropes or chains, but their arms and legs were clearly restricted. I felt a wave of nausea, and for a moment, I didn't know what to do. I stood there, staring at them, the reality of the situation sinking in. This wasn't just an accident, it was something worse. Much worse. I looked back at the truck's cab, wondering who the driver was, but there was no sign of anyone. No one had come to check on these people. I reached into my pocket for my phone again, trying to get a better signal to call 911, but it was useless. The signal was still terrible. I was standing there, trying to think, when I heard a sound. Footsteps. I quickly ducked behind the truck, my heart racing. I was so focused on the people in the back that I didn't hear them coming. It was two men, walking toward the truck, talking in low voices. I couldn't see them clearly, but I could hear their voices, and the tone wasn't friendly. They were laughing about something, but I didn't understand what. The rain was too loud. I held my breath, hoping they wouldn't spot me. I didn't know if they were the ones who had been driving the truck, or if they were involved in whatever this was, but I knew I couldn't stay hidden for much longer. I was terrified. I had no idea what to do. One of the men reached the truck first. He was wearing a raincoat, but the dark silhouette of his figure made him look even more menacing. The other man was behind him, walking toward the cages in the back. I pressed my back flat against the cold metal of the truck, praying they wouldn't turn around and see me. The first man opened the back of the truck with a sharp, metallic sound. I heard the rattling of the cages. The other man's voice rose up, something about checking the cargo. They weren't talking about the crash. They were talking about the people in those cages like they were nothing more than goods to be moved. I had no idea what to do. I had to help them, but if I moved, I was risking everything. I had no way of knowing if these men were armed or if they'd hurt me. I looked around quickly. The road was still empty, and there were no other houses for miles. I couldn't count on anyone else coming. I could feel the panic starting to rise again. My hands were trembling, and I didn't know how much longer I could stay quiet. I wanted to run, but I couldn't leave without calling for help. The phone was useless, but I had to get away from these men first. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. It was then that I heard the men talking again. One of them had opened a phone, and I heard a voice on the other end. They were discussing something about moving the cargo. It wasn't a rescue. It wasn't an accident. This was a plan. A sick, twisted plan. I slowly backed away, my eyes never leaving them. When I got far enough to where I thought they wouldn't hear me, I turned and ran as quietly as I could. I didn't look back until I got back to my car, and even then, I was afraid they might be following me. I didn't stop until I was in a safer area with better cell service. I finally called the police, but by the time they arrived, the truck and the men were gone. There was no trace of them. They must have heard the sirens coming, or maybe they knew the cops were on their way. I don't know, but it was gone. The cages were gone. The people, whoever they were gone. I've thought about that night every day since. I can't shake the image of those poor people in the back of that truck, trapped and helpless. I don't know what happened to them, but I hope they somehow got out. I hope they did. We thought it was going to be a good trip. The four of us, me, my girlfriend Kayla, and our friends Steve and Rachel, had planned it for weeks. We wanted to get away, somewhere quiet. No cell service, no work, no distractions. Just us in the woods. We picked a remote spot in a national forest, about a 2-hour hike from the parking area. We packed everything carefully: tents, sleeping bags, food, water, and a first aid kit. We even brought a satellite phone for emergencies, though we all agreed we wouldn't use it unless we had to. It wasn't about staying connected. It was about disconnecting. The first day was perfect. We reached the campsite in the afternoon, set up our tents, and had a fire going before sunset. The air smelled like pine, and the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle in the trees. We joked, we ate, and we stayed up late talking. It felt like we were the only people in the world. The trouble started the next morning. I was the first to wake up. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into the cold air, planning to start the fire again. But something felt off immediately. The campsite was too empty. The cooler, which we'd left near the fire pit, was gone. So was the bag with our snacks and cooking gear. At first, I thought maybe an animal had dragged it off. But when I looked closer, I didn't see any signs of that. No torn wrappers, no scattered cans. It was just gone, like someone had picked it up and walked away with it. I woke the others. They didn't believe me at first, but when we checked around the campsite, we realized it wasn't just the food that was missing. Kayla's small backpack, which had our first aid kit and some personal items, was gone too. And so was the satellite phone. We all stood there, staring at each other. It didn't make sense. None of us had heard anything during the night, and there were no obvious signs that anyone else had been around. But the fact was, someone had taken our stuff. We decided to split up and look around. Steve and I went one way, and Kayla and Rachel went another, agreeing to meet back in an hour. Steve and I followed a narrow path leading away from the campsite. It was overgrown and hard to navigate, but we figured it was as good a place as any to start. About 20 minutes in, we found something strange. A single can of soup, sitting upright in the middle of the trail. It was one of ours. I recognized the brand. But why would someone leave it there? It felt like a breadcrumb, but we didn't know if we should follow it. We turned back, uneasy. When we got back to the campsite, Kayla and Rachel were already there. They hadn't found anything except for some flattened grass near the edge of the site, like someone had been standing there, watching. We tried to stay calm. We still had some supplies, water bottles, a couple of energy bars we kept in our tents, and our sleeping gear. But the realization that someone had taken our food and the satellite phone made everything feel different. We weren't alone out here, and whoever was out there didn't want us to leave easily. The rest of the day was tense. We stayed close together, taking turns keeping watch while the others rested. As the sun went down, the forest seemed to close in around us. Every sound of the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made my skin crawl. That night, none of us slept much. Around midnight, we heard footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, circling the campsite. We didn't have a flashlight, one of the things that had been taken, so we sat in the dark, gripping the camping knives we had brought for food prep. The footsteps stopped after a while, but the damage was done. We were too scared to stay in the tents, so we sat around the cold fire pit, whispering about what to do. By morning, we decided to leave. We still had water and enough energy to make it back to the parking area. We packed up what little we had left and started walking. About an hour into the hike, we found something that made my stomach turn. Another one of our food items, a granola bar, this time sitting in the middle of the trail. Like the can of soup, it was perfectly placed, almost inviting us to take it. We didn't touch it. We didn't even stop. We just kept walking, faster now, our eyes darting to the trees on either side of the trail. I kept feeling like someone was watching us, but every time I turned around, the path was empty. Then we heard it. A snapping branch, close by. Too close. We froze, listening. The sound came again, from the right side of the trail. Kayla grabbed my arm, her eyes wide. Steve and Rachel were ahead of us, and Steve motioned for us to keep moving. But before we could, a man stepped out from behind a tree. He was tall and thin, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans. His face was pale, and he didn't say anything. He just stood there, blocking the trail. In his hand, he held a long hunting knife. None of us moved. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst. "Turn around," the man said, his voice low and flat. "Go back to your camp." Steve stepped forward, holding his own knife, though it looked laughably small compared to the man's. "We're leaving," Steve said. "We're going to the parking lot." The man tilted his head, like he was considering this. Then he smiled. "No, you're not." That's when Rachel screamed. Another man had appeared behind us, cutting off our escape. He was holding a machete, and his face was just as pale and expressionless as the first man's. I don't know how long we stood there, frozen, but it felt like forever. Then Kayla whispered, "Run." We bolted off the trail, into the trees. Branches whipped at my face and arms, but I didn't care. I could hear the men shouting behind us, their footsteps crashing through the undergrowth. I didn't dare look back. Eventually, we stumbled into a dry creek bed and followed it, hoping it would lead us somewhere safe. The shouting faded, but we didn't stop. We just kept going, even when my legs felt like they were going to give out. By some miracle, we found the parking area. Our car was still there, and we piled in, locking the doors and peeling out onto the road. None of us spoke until we were miles away. We reported it to the park authorities, but they didn't seem surprised. Apparently, there had been other incidents in the area, campers reporting stolen supplies or strange encounters, but nothing had ever come of it. We were lucky to get out. I don't know what those men wanted, and I don't want to think about what would have happened if we hadn't run. All I know is that I'll never go camping again. We had been camping for 2 days when it all started. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, just a group of friends looking to disconnect from our busy lives and spend some time in nature. No cell service, no distractions, just us in the woods. It was peaceful at first, just what we needed. The forest was quiet except for the occasional bird call or the rustling of the wind in the trees. We set up camp near a small creek, and everything was fine for the first day. We brought a portable radio with us to pass the time in the evenings. It was a cheap one, not anything fancy, just one of those small battery-operated models that could pick up the basic AM/FM stations. On the second night, after dinner and a few drinks, we sat around the fire and turned it on to see what we could pick up. There was nothing much on the regular stations, just static, so we started turning the dial randomly to see if we could find something more interesting. At first, it didn't seem like anything was out of the ordinary. We laughed, joked, and tried to make sense of the strange sounds we were hearing. The static would cut in and out, and we'd get fragments of voices now and then, but it was so garbled we could barely understand anything. We figured it was just bad reception, or maybe the batteries were starting to die. It wasn't until we started hearing clearer words that we began to get uneasy. It started with just a few short phrases. I remember one of the first ones, "They know where you are." It was barely audible at first, almost like a whisper lost in the static. At first, we thought it was just interference, something harmless. But the longer we listened, the more the voices began to come through. They were more distinct now, more deliberate. "Don't trust them. Stay inside tonight." It was the kind of thing that made you freeze for a moment. We all looked at each other, unsure of what to make of it. Was it a prank? Maybe some weird channel or station that was messing with us. But the voices, they didn't sound like radio hosts or anything normal. They sounded wrong. Like someone was trying to get a message through, but something was off. At first, we dismissed it. We laughed it off, tried to brush it away. We turned the dial again, and the voices stopped. We found another station, and the rest of the night went by quietly. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I kept hearing the words in my head, "Stay inside tonight," The next day, we went hiking during the day. It was a beautiful trail, and we enjoyed it, trying to forget about the strange occurrence from the night before. But when we got back to camp, the radio was still there, sitting on the log next to the fire pit. It was hard not to think about what happened, especially since the feeling in the air had changed. The wind had picked up, and the forest felt denser, like it was closing in on us. We didn't talk much about the radio. No one wanted to bring it up, but I think we were all thinking about it. It wasn't until nightfall that things really started to get strange. We sat down by the fire again, and one of us, Chris, I think, decided to mess with the radio again. This time, it wasn't just a few words. We picked up a full sentence, and it wasn't just static anymore. It was a voice, clear as day, like someone was right there with us. Get out of the woods. We froze. It wasn't one of us. It wasn't a joke. It was a deep, raspy voice, almost threatening. The kind of voice that made your blood run cold. We all turned to look at each other, confused, but none of us said anything. Chris quickly turned the dial to another station, and for a few minutes, the radio was silent again. But it didn't stay that way. The static returned, but this time the words were louder, clearer, more urgent. They know you're here. They're watching. That's when it really hit me. My heart started to pound. This wasn't a coincidence. There was no way it could be. Someone was sending these messages. But who? And why? We tried turning the radio off, but as soon as we turned it back on, the same voice came through. Don't trust them. They're coming for you. At that point, I think we all realized something was seriously wrong. This wasn't just a weird coincidence anymore. I don't know what it was, but something was out there, and it knew we were here. The voices weren't random, they were directed at us. We didn't know what to do. We debated packing up and leaving, but it was getting late, and none of us wanted to make the hike back in the dark. We tried to stay calm, but every time we heard those messages, it felt like the forest was closing in on us. The firelight flickered, and the shadows around us seemed to grow longer, stretching toward us. The worst part was when the messages started to get more specific. You're not alone. Come out. We know you're hiding. That last one hit me the hardest. We weren't hiding. We were sitting there, by the fire, in plain sight. But the voice made it sound like we were being watched, like someone was waiting for us to make a move. I don't know how much time passed after that. We were all on edge, jumping at every sound, every movement in the trees. No one spoke for a long time. We just sat there, staring at the fire, listening to the radio crackling in the background. Then, around midnight, it happened. The message came through again, only this time it wasn't a warning. It was a command. Leave the camp. Now. I don't think any of us hesitated. We grabbed our things, packed up as quickly as we could, and started to head out. I don't know what we thought we were running from, but we couldn't stay there anymore. It felt like we were being hunted. We made it back to the parking lot and into our cars. No one said a word. We just got in, started the engines, and left. As we drove away, the radio continued to crackle behind us, but we didn't dare turn it back on. We never went back to that spot. We couldn't. The feeling of being watched, the messages, the way the forest felt like it was closing in on us, it was too much. To this day, I don't know who was sending those messages. I don't know what they wanted or why they were following us. But I do know that something was out there in those woods, something that wanted us to leave. And I'm not ever going back to find out who or what it was. It's taken me a long time to finally put this down, and even now, I'm not sure I can make sense of it. It feels strange to even talk about. I never thought something like this could happen, but it did, and I'm still not sure how to feel about it. It all started a few months ago when a new guy started working at the office. His name was Mark. I didn't think much of him at first, just another guy in the cubicles, trying to settle in. I noticed he seemed to be friendly, always asking questions, a little too eager to help. He would chat with me more than with anyone else, asking about my day, asking if I wanted coffee, offering to run small errands for me. He was nice enough, I guess, but I started feeling uncomfortable after a while. His attention was a little too much, too often. But I brushed it off, figuring I was just being paranoid. Then came the first strange thing. One day, I came into the office, and there was a small plant on my desk. Not just any plant either, a little succulent, in a ceramic pot with a handwritten note that said, "I thought this would make your day brighter." I didn't recognize the handwriting, and there was no name. I stared at it for a moment, unsure of what to do. I didn't want to sound ungrateful, but it felt odd, especially coming from someone I barely knew. Still, I thought maybe it was just a nice gesture. Maybe someone was just being friendly. Maybe I was overthinking it. The next day, another gift. A coffee mug. It wasn't the same as the plant this time. The mug was just a generic one, but it had my favorite color on it. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was too specific. But again, I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I put the mug in my cabinet and tried to forget about it. But it didn't stop there. Over the next few weeks, it became a pattern. Little notes, small gifts, always things that felt a little too personal. A new set of pens with my initials on them. A box of chocolates with a message that said, "For your sweet smile." It was always just the right amount of thoughtfulness to seem like a nice gesture, but at the same time, it always felt off. It wasn't that I didn't appreciate kindness, I did, but the more these gifts piled up, the more I felt trapped. I never knew how to respond, or even if I should. I started to notice Mark more. He'd be standing a little too close when he talked to me. He'd give me this odd, almost vacant smile whenever I tried to step away from him. There was something about his eyes that made me feel uneasy. But he was always polite, always professional, so I tried not to make a big deal out of it. After all, I didn't want to seem rude or paranoid. Then came the first incident that really made me uncomfortable. One evening, I was leaving work a little later than usual, and as I was walking to my car, I saw Mark standing in the parking lot. I figured maybe he was just waiting for someone else or having a smoke, but then I realized he was looking directly at me. Not just glancing over, but really watching. It was unnerving. When I waved and said goodbye, he didn't wave back. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on me. I brushed it off as weird timing. Maybe he was waiting for his ride. Maybe he hadn't seen me leave. But the next day, when I got to work, there was another note on my desk. "I saw you leaving last night. You looked like you needed some fresh air." That was when my stomach dropped. How could he have known that unless he was watching me? I tried to laugh it off, but I couldn't. I kept telling myself I was being ridiculous, that I was just overreacting. But something was wrong. I didn't want to confront him, didn't want to make it awkward or escalate things, so I stayed quiet. But the weirdness continued. A few days later, when I was out running errands after work, I ran into him at a coffee shop. I hadn't told anyone where I was going, so the coincidence felt off. He smiled at me, a little too eagerly. "I didn't know you came here," he said. "I love this place." I felt my stomach twist. "Yeah, it's a nice spot," I said, forcing a smile. I didn't know what to do. I was trying to be polite, but my mind was racing. Why was he here? How did he know this was where I liked to go? Things only escalated from there. Over the next couple of weeks, I started noticing him showing up in places I frequented, cafes, stores, even the gym. He never said anything when I saw him. He would just smile, wave, and act like it was the most normal thing in the world. But I was starting to get scared. It wasn't just the gifts anymore. It wasn't just the notes. It was the fact that he seemed to be following me. I tried to avoid him, taking different routes home, changing up my routine. But it didn't seem to matter. No matter where I went, Mark always seemed to be there. At first, it was easy enough to brush off as coincidence, but then I started noticing things I couldn't ignore. I came into work one morning to find a picture of myself sitting on my desk. It was a photo of me walking into a store the day before. He had taken it from a distance, but it was definitely me. There was a note attached. I like the way you dress. You always look so nice. That was the breaking point for me. I couldn't take it anymore. I didn't feel safe. I didn't feel like I could trust anyone anymore, not even the people I worked with. I'd spent weeks trying to figure out how to handle it, but this was too much. I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. I went to my manager and told her everything. I showed her the pictures, the notes, the gifts. She was surprised, shocked even. She had no idea anything was going on. But I knew something had to be done. We decided to report it to HR, who in turn contacted the security team and said they would look into it. Mark was called into the office for a meeting the next day. And after that, he was never seen again. No one ever said what happened. There was no explanation, no word about whether he was let go or if there were any consequences. All I know is that he was gone, and the gifts stopped. The notes stopped. But I still feel uneasy sometimes. I still wonder if he's out there, watching me. It's hard to shake that feeling. I don't know what he wanted, and I don't know why he chose me. But I know I never want to go through something like that again. I don't think anyone should ever have to. It started about a month after I moved into the duplex. I wasn't paying much attention at first because I was juggling work and my son, Ethan. He's 6, and it's just the two of us since his dad and I split. We'd moved into the place because the rent was manageable, and it was close to his school and my job. The first thing I noticed was the back door. I always locked it before leaving for work, always. One morning, I came back from dropping Ethan off and found it unlocked. At first, I thought maybe I'd forgotten. Life's busy, right? But it kept happening. One day, I found a sticky note on the fridge. It was a generic yellow square, but it wasn't mine. It just said, "Nice place." I didn't know what to make of it. Ethan didn't know how to write well enough to leave it, and he hadn't even been home that day. I threw it away, thinking it was a prank or maybe something that had somehow stuck from a store or something weird. I didn't want to overthink it. Then other things started showing up. A pen on the table I didn't recognize, a mug on the counter I was sure I hadn't put there. I started asking Ethan if he'd been playing with anything, but he just looked confused and said no. A week later, I found a note folded into my work bag. It just said, "You're doing great." I should have felt comforted, I guess, but my stomach dropped. Who writes something like that and leaves it where I definitely see it? I thought maybe a coworker had slipped it in, but I didn't bring that bag inside work. It stayed in the car. I started double-checking all the locks. The front door, back door, the windows. I'd even prop a chair against the door at night. But it didn't help. I'd come home and find little things moved, cushions off the couch, shoes lined up differently. The worst was the laundry. I don't have a dryer, so I hang things up in the small laundry room by the kitchen. One afternoon, I found Ethan's school uniform folded perfectly on the counter. I hadn't folded it. I started looking at the neighbors differently. Most of them kept to themselves, but the guy in the other half of the duplex stood out. His name was Mike, and he'd introduced himself when I moved in. He seemed nice, but he was nosy. He always made comments about when I left or came back. Early start today, huh? Or you're home late. At first, I thought he was just being friendly, but now I wondered if he was paying too much attention. One night, I heard creaking downstairs. Ethan was asleep, and I was in bed, but the sound made me sit straight up. It was subtle, like someone trying to move quietly. I grabbed my phone and texted Mike. He replied immediately, saying he was out of town. That's when I really started panicking. I didn't sleep that night, just sat in my room with a kitchen knife, listening to every sound until the sun came up. The next day, I called a locksmith. He changed the locks on both doors, and I felt a little better. For about a week, everything seemed normal. Then I found another note. It was tucked into Ethan's favorite book on the shelf in the living room. It said, "Cute kid." I took Ethan to my mom's that night. I couldn't stay there, not knowing what was going on. I reported it to the police, but they didn't seem too concerned. There was no sign of forced entry, no real evidence of a crime. Just keep an eye out, they said. I decided to set up cameras. Cheap ones I bought online, but they worked. I placed one in the living room, one in the kitchen, and one at the back door. I didn't tell anyone, not even Mike. The first few nights, nothing happened. Then, on the third night, I saw him. Mike. He used a key. He walked into my house like it was his. He didn't even look around, just went straight to the kitchen, opened the fridge, and grabbed a soda. Then he sat on my couch and watched TV. My TV. I didn't even know what to do. I felt sick watching it. He got up after about half an hour, went into the laundry room, and just stood there, looking at the clothes on the rack. Then he left. I called the police again and showed them the footage. They took it seriously this time. They came out and arrested him. It turned out he'd made a copy of the key before I moved in. He'd lived in my half of the duplex before me and still had access. They found other keys at his place, and notes he'd written, detailed ones about me and Ethan, our schedules, what we ate, what time I went to bed. It's been months, and I still can't sleep well. I moved out a week after it happened. Ethan doesn't know the full story, and I don't plan on telling him. I just want to forget it, but I don't think I ever will. Knowing someone was in my space, watching us, touching our things. It's something I can't shake. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway, nothing fancy. A few friends and I, just wanting to disconnect for a bit, get away from our regular routines. We decided on a spot deep in the woods, far away from any tourist trail. There were 5 of us in total, and we were all in our mid-20s, just looking for some quiet, fresh air, and a little bit of adventure. We'd been hiking for a few hours when we stumbled upon it. The cabin. It wasn't exactly hidden, but it was definitely off the beaten path. We came across it while walking along the edge of a creek, our feet tired and our conversations dying down as we started to focus more on the hike itself. The cabin sat there, not far from the water. It was small, made of dark wood, with a roof that was clearly older than the rest of the structure. From where we were standing, it looked abandoned, dirty windows, the kind of place you'd assume hadn't been lived in for years. The moment we saw it, the thought that ran through my head was simple. It was a good place to check out for a few minutes. A nice break from the hike. "We should check it out," said Nick, the most adventurous of the group. "Could be interesting. Might even find some cool old stuff." We all agreed, mostly out of curiosity. We didn't have anything better to do, and it was still early in the afternoon, so we had plenty of time. We walked up the short trail to the front door. The porch creaked under our feet. It had that old, musty smell, a mix of rotting wood and dampness. I didn't think anything of it at the time, but I remember the air feeling colder as we got closer. Nick knocked, but no one answered. He turned the knob, and the door creaked open as if it had been waiting for us. The first thing I noticed when we stepped inside was the silence. It was like the place hadn't been disturbed in years, but at the same time, it felt wrong. I couldn't shake the sense that we weren't supposed to be there. The inside was just as you'd expect: old furniture, some broken chairs, a table covered in dust. But there was something off. On the far wall, there were a bunch of photographs, pinned up with crooked tacks. I stepped closer to get a better look. They weren't normal photos. There were faces, but they all had something about them, something unsettling. Some were of people I didn't recognize, but others, they looked like they were taken recently, like they'd been watching the people in the photos for longer than they should have. Nick was over by a table on the other side of the room, flipping through some papers. He muttered something under his breath, but I was too focused on the photos to catch it. I turned to see what he'd found and saw what looked like a bunch of maps. My heart skipped a beat. They were of the forest, of the area around where we were camping. And then I saw it. Our campsite was marked on the map, along with a bunch of other little marks. Trails, paths, and locations. But what made my stomach turn was the detail. There were notes on some of the places, things like watch or wait scribbled in the margins. "Guys, you need to see this." Nick's voice pulled me away from the map. I glanced over to see him standing near a small shelf, holding something. It looked like a bundle of old documents, but the moment I saw it, my stomach sank. It was a collection of notebooks, all filled with handwritten notes. He flipped through one of them, the pages yellowed and brittle, like they hadn't been touched in years. The handwriting was shaky, erratic, almost manic. It didn't take long to realize what I was looking at. The notes were about people with different names, descriptions, and dates. Some of the names were familiar, ones I recognized from the photos on the wall, and they were marked with strange symbols. But what was worse, the notes didn't just describe these people, they seemed to track their movements, even their behaviors, like someone had been following them. There were details about where they'd been, who they'd talked to, and what they'd been doing. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. The whole place felt wrong now, like it was suffocating me. "Guys, this isn't just a random cabin. We need to get out of here," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Now!" But no one moved. They were all still looking at the maps and photos. It was as if they couldn't tear themselves away from it. I moved closer to the back of the cabin, where there was a door leading to what looked like a small bedroom. I felt my heart racing. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, I saw something that made me freeze. The room wasn't just empty. It was filled with more photos, more of those faces, and along the floor, scattered around, were piles of used, crumpled up wrappers from some kind of food. But there was something more disturbing. The walls were covered in scratches, not from animals or weather, but deep gouges, as though someone had scraped at the wood with their fingernails. I backed out of the room, my breath coming quicker. I called to the others. We need to leave. Now. This place isn't safe. That's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Someone had been following us. A figure stood in the doorway of the cabin, just outside, barely visible against the fading light. It was too far for me to see clearly, but I could tell it was a person. My heart hammered in my chest. "Guys," I said, almost in a whisper. "Someone's out there." Nick was the first to react, pushing past me to look out the door, but by the time we all moved to the front, the figure was gone. The woods outside looked empty, but the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. It was like the world outside had gone silent, and the only sound was the pounding of my own heart. Without another word, we grabbed our stuff and rushed out of the cabin, not bothering to close the door behind us. We didn't even look back. We just ran. We didn't speak much, but I could tell everyone was feeling the same sense of dread. We didn't stay in the forest after that. We packed up our camp and left before nightfall, driving back to town without a word. We couldn't explain what we saw or what that place was, but we all agreed on one thing: we weren't going back there. Ever. Since that day, I haven't been able to forget what I saw in that cabin, the photographs, the maps, the notes. I don't know who was watching us, or if they were still out there, but I can't shake the feeling that someone is. And it's been months since that day, but I still can't stop thinking about that cabin and the eyes that seem to be watching us, waiting for us to leave. It was one of those nights where the rain never really stops. The kind of storm that makes the streets look like rivers, and the wind howls loud enough to drown out everything else. I had been walking home from my shift at work, soaked through despite the umbrella, and I was so ready to be inside, away from the weather. I pulled out my phone and ordered a rideshare, not bothering to check which car it was. I just wanted to get home. I watched the little map on my phone, waiting for the car to pull up. I wasn't far from the usual spot where I'd get picked up, and I saw the pin slowly move closer, the car approaching. As it got near, I stepped to the curb and looked up. A black sedan was coming down the road, slowing down. I stepped forward, glad the wait was almost over. When the car stopped in front of me, the window rolled down, and the driver looked out. He was older, maybe in his 50s, with dark hair and a beard. His face was tired, like he hadn't slept in a while. I didn't think much of it. I got in the back seat, thanked him, and told him where I was headed. I just wanted to get home, have some tea, and relax. The last thing on my mind was that something was wrong. The driver didn't respond immediately. He just nodded, and then he started driving. The route on my app didn't seem right, though. We weren't heading in the direction I expected. I had been in this part of town enough to know the main roads, and I could tell we were heading south when I should have been going north. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think you're going the wrong way." He didn't say anything at first. Just kept driving. I thought maybe he hadn't heard me, or maybe he was new to the area. I tried again. "I need to go to Maple Street, not South Boulevard." "You've missed the turn." He glanced at me through the rearview mirror, and I caught the briefest glimpse of something strange in his eyes. It wasn't anger or annoyance. It was something else. Something colder. But then he spoke. "It's a shortcut," he said, his voice flat, like he was explaining something simple. "Don't worry. You'll get there." I didn't believe him. I checked my phone again. The little pin on the map was still moving in the wrong direction. We weren't heading toward Maple Street. The more I stared at the screen, the more I realized we were going farther away from where I needed to be. "Are you sure about this?" I said, trying to keep the fear from my voice. "I really need to go that way." I pointed to the north, trying to be calm, but I felt a rising sense of panic. The driver didn't reply. Instead, he just turned the corner and accelerated. The streets were empty, and the rain continued to fall, hammering against the car's roof. I tried not to think too much about the fact that we were now on streets I didn't recognize. "Hey, can you stop the car?" I asked, my heart starting to beat faster. "I need to get out." He still didn't respond. He didn't even glance at me in the mirror this time. I began to feel the weight of the silence in the car. It felt oppressive, like the air itself was thickening. I could hear the sound of the rain hitting the windshield and the hum of the engine, but it all felt distant. I was alone in this car with him, and it was getting harder to ignore the sinking feeling in my stomach. I wasn't sure what was happening. This wasn't just a mistake anymore. This felt deliberate. I needed to get out. I needed to get home. "Stop the car," I demanded, louder this time, my voice trembling. "I'm not going any farther with you. Stop the car, now." Finally, he glanced at me in the mirror. He didn't smile. He didn't look worried. He just looked tired. As if he had been waiting for me to say something for a long time. "You're going to be fine," he said, his voice low and calm, like he was trying to reassure me. But I could hear something in it that made my skin crawl. It wasn't reassuring. It was cold. And it didn't sound like he was trying to comfort me. It sounded like a command. "I'm serious," I said, my voice shaking. "Pull over. Let me out." But he didn't. The car kept moving. The streets around us were getting more desolate. The houses were spaced farther apart, and I couldn't even see streetlights now, just a dim glow of his headlights cutting through the rain-soaked night. My mind was racing. I reached for my phone again, hands shaking, and I tried to send a message to a friend. My hands were so wet that I could barely type, but I managed to send the message. "Something's wrong. The driver is going the wrong way. Please call the cops if I don't respond." It felt like forever before I saw him glance in the mirror again. This time, his eyes lingered longer, and I knew without a doubt that something was wrong. He wasn't taking me to my destination. He was taking me somewhere else. "Where are we going?" I asked, trying to stay calm, but my voice betrayed me, breaking as I spoke. "Relax," he said again, his voice like a slow drawl. "You're going to be fine. We're almost there." I had no idea where there was, but I wasn't about to find out. I shoved my phone back into my pocket and tried the door. It was locked. I tried to press the button to open the door from the inside, but it didn't work. He had locked it. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked around the car, desperate for something, anything to help. I had to get out. I reached for the handle again, this time pulling with everything I had. The door clicked, and I didn't hesitate. I opened the door, yanked it wide, and as the car slowed for a turn, I threw myself out of it. I hit the wet pavement hard, my knees scraping against the ground as I scrambled to my feet. The car didn't stop. It didn't even slow down. I didn't look back. I just ran. My shoes were soaked, my legs screaming, but I didn't care. I ran and ran, not stopping until I found a house with lights on. I knocked frantically, and someone finally answered. A woman in her pajamas, clearly startled. I couldn't even explain myself properly. I was so shaken. But she took one look at me and called the police. The cops came. I don't know what they did with the driver, but I know I never saw him again. They didn't find him that night, not in the places I thought he might have gone. They said it was likely he just picked someone up for whatever reason and got scared when I tried to leave. Maybe he was trying to get away with something. I don't know. The ride was supposed to be the end of my shift, the end of a tiring night. But it turned into something else. Something I won't forget. That driver, he wasn't just lost. He knew exactly where he was going. And I'm just glad I got out when I did. I don't take ride sharing anymore. Not after that night. It happened during a layover. I had a few hours to kill before my next flight, so I was just hanging around the airport, trying to pass the time. I'd been traveling for what felt like forever, and my head was starting to ache from the combination of exhaustion and the constant noise of the terminal. I wasn't in the best mood, but it wasn't a big deal. I figured I'd just sit and wait for my boarding time. I found an empty seat by one of the gates, just far enough from the crowd so I could have a little peace. I pulled out my phone, started scrolling through emails and news, trying to distract myself. About an hour passed like that, nothing eventful. I didn't even notice the man sitting down next to me at first. He seemed normal enough. He smiled and said, "Looks like you've got a while to wait." I nodded. Yeah, just killing time. I didn't expect much from the conversation, but I wasn't in a rush to be rude either. He introduced himself as Tim. He was wearing a business suit, probably in his late 30s, with short, neatly combed hair. He seemed friendly, nothing off about him. He was just another traveler, like me. He told me he had just come back from a business trip and was waiting for his connecting flight. We chatted a little about where we were both headed, and I assumed it was just small talk to pass the time. Then, after a few minutes, he asked if I'd ever been to the city we were both flying into. I told him I hadn't, but that I was excited to check it out. That's when he leaned in a bit, lowered his voice, and said something that caught me off guard. "You know, if you need help with directions, I've got some great local tips. I've been to that city a few times, and I know a guy who can really help you out. He's the best driver in town, doesn't charge too much, and he can show you all the best spots. It's nice to have someone who knows the area, especially when you're traveling alone." I thought it was a bit strange, but it wasn't like I hadn't heard similar things before. People in airports were always offering advice, and I didn't think much of it. I thanked him and said I'd probably just take a taxi from the airport. But Tim wouldn't let it go. He kept talking about how much easier it would be to get around if I used his guy, how much cheaper it would be than a regular taxi, and how much more reliable the service was. He even said that if I didn't mind waiting a bit, he'd make a call for me and set it up. I was starting to feel a little uncomfortable. I wasn't sure why, but something about the whole situation didn't sit right with me. The way he kept insisting, the fact that he was almost too eager. But I figured I was just overthinking it. I'd been traveling for hours. My mind was foggy. "All right," I said. "Maybe I'll take you up on that. But I'll let you know if I change my mind." Tim smiled, and that's when things started to shift in a way I couldn't quite put my finger on. It wasn't a bad smile, exactly, but it was too smooth, too practiced. "No problem," he said. "I'll just go make the call and we'll get you all set up. It'll be easier for you, trust me." I watched as he stood up and walked toward the back of the terminal, dialing something on his phone. I didn't think much of it, still half distracted by my own thoughts. A few minutes later, he returned, looking pleased. "It's all set," he said. "The driver will meet you right by the exit. He's expecting you, so you won't have to wait around." I felt a twinge of doubt but told myself it was fine. It was just a ride. I was being paranoid. Tim seemed nice enough. I thanked him, and he said it was no trouble, just doing a favor for a fellow traveler. I followed him to the exit of the airport, where I saw a man standing by a car. He was wearing dark sunglasses, even though it was still light outside, and he was holding a sign with my name on it. It all seemed so normal, so official, that I almost didn't question it. But something nagged at me. Tim stood there, watching me, his hands in his pockets, like he was waiting for something. "There he is," Tim said, his voice too calm. "You'll be in good hands." I hesitated for a moment, but the man with the sign smiled at me and waved. I walked up to him, told him my name, and he nodded. "Right this way," he said, opening the back door of the car. I was about to climb in when I noticed something odd. There was a faint smell inside the car, something like stale air mixed with cleaning chemicals. And the car wasn't a typical taxi, it looked more like a private vehicle, older, and there were no obvious markings. That's when I heard Tim's voice behind me, still too calm, still a little too eager. "Don't worry," he said. "This is the best way to go. You'll get there much faster, and you won't have to deal with the hassle of the airport." I froze. Something clicked. A thought flashed through my mind. This wasn't right. There was no reason for him to be so invested in my ride. There was no reason for him to be pushing this so hard. I quickly turned around and walked away from the car. The man with the sign started to follow me, and that's when I realized how wrong everything felt. Tim stayed by the door of the car, his eyes watching me intently. I didn't know what to do, but I knew I had to get away. I ran back inside the terminal, looking around for security, for someone who might help. The man with the sign didn't follow me, but Tim did. He was walking toward me, his expression hardening, no longer friendly. I made my way to the nearest gate, where a security guard was standing. I went up to him, explained everything as best I could, and showed him the man's picture on my phone. He looked at me like I was crazy, but when I pointed out that the situation didn't feel right, he called for backup. Turns out, the whole thing was a scam. Tim wasn't a fellow traveler, and the driver wasn't really a driver. They were part of a group that targeted people with long layovers, offering them rides that were just a setup for robbery or worse. They had a whole operation going, luring unsuspecting people with offers of cheap, convenient transportation. I never found out how far they would have gone if I'd gotten in that car, but I'm sure it wouldn't have ended well. I'm just glad I walked away in time. The rest of my layover was spent in a corner of the terminal, surrounded by security. When I finally boarded my flight, I could still feel the tension in my chest, the creeping feeling that I'd narrowly escaped something much worse. I won't be trusting strangers in airports again. Not ever. I worked the night shift as a janitor in a big office building downtown. The kind of place that's never really empty, but there's nobody around at night except for me. The building is old, probably from the 70s, and it creaks a lot. The whole place is quiet, too quiet sometimes, but I've always gotten used to it. One night, things started getting weird. I was on the top floor, doing my usual rounds, mopping the halls when I heard a sound. At first, I thought it was the air conditioning kicking on or maybe a rat, but then it came again, a low thud followed by something that sounded like dragging. I froze, thinking it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But then it happened again. I figured maybe one of the workers had left something behind, or maybe I wasn't the only one left in the building. It was late, around 3 a.m., and I was alone on the upper floors, so I wasn't too worried. I went down the hall, following the sound toward the old elevator shaft. It was dark back there, not the kind of place anyone would typically go. The elevator was out of service, but there was a maintenance room nearby with an old key I had from when I started working there. I used it to open the door and turn the light on, half expecting to see an open window or a draft causing the weird noise. But there was nothing like that. The room was just filled with old equipment, and the walls had a layer of dust on them. No signs of anyone being in there. I was about to turn back when I heard it again. This time, it sounded like it was coming from above. I looked up toward the ceiling, trying to figure out what could be up there, and that's when I saw something strange. The old air vents were covered in what looked like footprints. I froze again. I knew for a fact nobody had been up there. The building had been locked up for weeks, and the upper floors were completely unused. But someone had been up there recently. The prints led up toward the ceiling, like someone had climbed inside the vent system. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just another prank. Maybe some college kids had gotten in somehow. I walked back toward the stairwell, feeling uneasy. The elevator shaft was right next to the stairs, and as I turned the corner, I saw something move. It was a person. A man. He wasn't in a uniform or anything, just a regular guy, but he was moving in a way that made me uncomfortable, slow, almost like he was trying to be quiet. I didn't know who he was or what he was doing there, but I froze. He hadn't noticed me yet, so I quickly ducked around the corner, holding my breath. I heard him stop for a moment, and then the footsteps started again, this time closer. It was then that I realized he must have been living up there. I could hear him shuffling around, like he was rummaging through something. I felt a wave of panic rush through me, but I didn't know what to do. I wasn't trained to handle situations like this. I slowly backed up toward the stairwell. The last thing I wanted was for him to know I was there, but I was so scared that I accidentally knocked over a mop bucket. It clattered loudly against the tile floor, echoing down the hall. The man froze. I didn't wait for him to make the next move. I turned and bolted for the stairwell. I wasn't thinking clearly. I just needed to get out. I could hear him coming after me, his footsteps slapping against the linoleum, getting closer. I slammed open the door to the stairwell and ran down, 3 floors at once. My heart was racing, my mind telling me to go faster, but I couldn't get my legs to move any quicker. I reached the ground floor and ran straight to the front desk. The night security guard was there, sitting behind the desk, but his back was to me. I was out of breath, trying to explain what happened, but he didn't seem concerned. "There's no one up there," he said, turning around to look at me. "What do you mean there's no one?" "I just saw someone," I said, my voice shaking. He shrugged, like it was nothing. "Maybe a homeless person snuck in through the back. We've had a few of them before." I didn't know if I believed him. I didn't know who to trust anymore. But I didn't want to stick around to find out. The next day, I called the building manager and told him about the footprints and the man I had seen. He didn't seem to care much either. He said the place had been empty for a long time and that they had already hired security to handle the situation if anything unusual came up. I thought about what would have happened if I had been too slow or if the guy had caught me. I haven't been back to the top floor since that night, and I've heard from other janitors that they've been noticing strange things too. We all keep our distance from the upper floors now. I don't know who was up there, or how long they've been living in the building, but every time I hear a strange noise late at night, I remember the feeling of being watched from the shadows. It still keeps me up sometimes, wondering if they're still there.